Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a tomb beneath the hot Egyptian sands. Not for treasure, but for something way weirder. We're talking about the pharaohs' diets. Yes, the most powerful people in the ancient world were basically living like it was an eternal buffet. And the results? Well, you'll see. You've probably seen the glistening gold masks, the towering statues, the long rows of perfect hieroglyphs etched into stone. What you don't see are the clogged arteries, the overworked pancreases, and the serious bloating going on behind those regal smiles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and time in the comments too. I love seeing where and when people are watching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in a throne room, but in a CT scanner. Seriously. In the early 2000s, researchers got access to royal mummies, those elegant linen-wrapped relics of Egypt's glittering past, and did the unthinkable. They put them through medical imaging. It was the archaeological equivalent of looking at someone's 5,000-year-old X-rays. The findings? Not majestic. Turns out several pharaohs, including the famously young and golden Tutankhamun, were showing signs of serious health problems. Malformed bones, likely caused by genetic inbreeding, sure, but also indicators of obesity, high cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease. Let that sink in. Ancient Egypt, land of precision-built pyramids and star-aligned temples, couldn't manage to feed its leaders in a way that didn't kill them. And it wasn't just one or two bad apples. Across dynasties and centuries, there's a pattern of declining health in royal mummies. Some were so overweight that their organs were badly compressed, their arteries fossilized with plaque, their hearts either calcified or missing entirely by the time they were embalmed. The embalmers, bless them, seemed to notice something was off. In more than a few cases, they actually stuffed linen inside the corpse to smooth out sags and bulges. A literal ancient version of photoshopping. But how did we even figure all this out? Egyptologists and forensic specialists teamed up, cross-referencing tomb art, burial inscriptions, and archaeological evidence with modern medical scans. One surprising star of this weird intersection of science and history, Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled with full regalia and a false beard. Her mummy, misidentified for decades, showed signs of severe obesity and likely diabetes. She was buried with dental abscess, a broken back, and most notably, a giant bottle of skin lotion made with toxic compounds that may have contributed to her death. Makeup and munchies, a royal combo. It's not just one-off cases. Ramses II, aka Ramses the Great, had severe arthritis and dental decay, possibly from a sugar-heavy diet. His arteries were also narrowing and his skin bore faint traces of lesions that might have come from poor circulation. These were not warriors dying in battle. These were people slowly deteriorating under layers of silk, privilege, and roast duck. And here's the weird part. Many of these kings were still deified, like full-blown, you are the son of the sun god deified, which meant nobody dared say, hey your highness, maybe ease up on the honey-soaked pastries. The pharaoh's body wasn't just his own, it was a symbol of the state. And if the state looked like a bloated, prematurely aging man with foot pain and constipation, well, that was divine too. What's still debated is whether this pattern was universal. Some scholars argue that the worst examples come from late-era pharaohs, when Egyptian power was fading and outside influences, hello Greek-style feasting were creeping in. Earlier dynasties may have had stricter ceremonial diets, but then again, those early mummies are harder to examine. Many were stolen, lost or damaged. So we don't really know if this was a long, slow decline, or a systemic indulgence baked into the role of being king. There's also the artistic paradox. Egyptian art is known for its stylization. You probably picture pharaohs standing stiffly sideways, looking eternally youthful with perfect posture and not an ounce of visible belly fat. But not all art lied equally. Take, for instance, the controversial images of Akhenaten. He's often depicted with a protruding stomach, wide hips, and an androgynous frame. Some thought it was an artistic revolution. Others now wonder if it's a clue to his real, perhaps less than healthy body. Was it body positivity, symbolic weirdness, or just reality sneaking in? By the way, did you know that some mummies have been found with literal layers of fat still preserved in their tissues? That's right. Despite the extreme dryness and millennia underground, some royal bodies still had enough fat to study. One particularly well-preserved mummy showed a layer of subcutaneous fat nearly an inch thick across the abdomen, ancient Egypt's version of a spare tyre. And then there's the forensic fringe stuff. Some researchers have floated wild theories, like ancient genetic conditions causing rapid weight gain, or even strange reactions to ceremonial drugs or cosmetics. One French pathologist suggested a link between long-term exposure to incense and metabolic damage. Not widely accepted, but a fun twist in the tale. Still, the core of the story remains frustratingly modern. Power, indulgence, lack of checks and balances, and the slow, preventable march toward chronic disease. These pharaohs weren't just victims of their time, they were also creators of it, shaping a culture where divine right trumped diet plans, and where the waistline was just another place to display wealth. And you, if you were there, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not the food, not the pressure, and definitely not the embalming. The sheer salt content alone in their preserved meat could knock out your kidneys. But tonight you're safe. You're in your bed, breathing slowly, letting the past drift around you like the Nile at sunset. And we've only just begun to unwrap this story. You blink it a little as the flickering torchlight of imagination steadies, and now you're standing in the middle of a royal feast. It's loud, hot, and smells like roasted goose fat mixed with frankincense. This is not your typical dinner party. This is a high-tier pharaonic banquet, where the menu reads like a death wish for your arteries. On long wooden tables lacquered with resin and decorated with carved lotuses, you see stacks of honey-glazed bread, bowls overflowing with figs and dates, and thick slabs of fatty meat sweating under the heat. Somewhere to your left, a servant pours fermented date wine into golden cups, while a dancer in a perfumed wig shuffles by, hip bells jingling. Welcome to luxury ancient Egyptian style. Let's talk about the food. A typical royal meal started with bread. Always bread. Not just one kind either. There were dozens of variations, from plain barley loaves to honey-spiced, fruit-stuffed pastries. And these weren't your delicate baguette-type carbs. These were dense, gritty blocks of baked wheat and emmer, often filled with bits of sand thanks to ancient grinding tools. Tasty, maybe. Digestible, eventually. Healthy, not remotely. Next came the meats. Cattle were rare and sacred, so if you were a pharaoh, eating beef was not just a treat, it was a power move. Add to that ducks, geese, pigeons, and the occasional roasted ibex, and suddenly your plate looks more like a carnivore's fever dream. All of it was cooked in fat, slathered in honey, or salted into oblivion. Salt wasn't just for preservation, it was a flavour enhancer, and for the elite, salt was sprinkled with a generous hand. And don't forget fish. The Nile offered bountiful catches, but fish was considered low-tier food, everyday stuff for the commoners, unless of course it was specially prepared, dried, and seasoned with imported spices. Then it was deemed fit for the divine stomach. What about vegetables, you ask? Well, here's the thing. Veggies were around, onions, leeks, cucumbers, but they didn't scream royalty, so they were sidelined. If you were a pharaoh, you didn't need roughage. You needed symbolism, flavour, and the kind of calories that said, I'm too important to chew celery. The wildest part, this wasn't even a rare occasion. Banquets like this were part of court life, religious festivals, offerings to the gods, or political celebrations. And when there wasn't a festival, the daily diet of a pharaoh still leaned heavy, literally, on the same indulgent pattern. Meals were rich, repetitive, and intentionally abundant. The idea was that the king should never know hunger, not even the whisper of it. Hunger was for the Nile labourers and canal diggers, not the divine on earth. Wine played a major role too. Grown in royal vineyards in the delta and fermented in clay jars, wine was consumed often, especially during rituals and feasts. And unlike today's dry reds and whites, ancient Egyptian wine was thick, sweet and syrupy, almost like drinking alcoholic jam. That meant a huge sugar load with every goblet. You're probably imagining a king swirling wine in a goblet and waxing poetic about Osiris. But reality? He was probably bloated, sweaty, and slightly tipsy before sundown. A quirky side note here. There are actual banquet guest lists etched into stone, complete with menu breakdowns. Some temple records note preparations for royal meals with multiple animals slaughtered in a single day. One New Kingdom list included 20 geese, 7 oxen, a dozen jars of wine, and cakes many. Just many. A Apparently they didn't even bother counting at a certain point. Now, picture the long-term effects of this kind of eating. The royal body became a storage unit for fat, sugar and cholesterol. And not just externally, you weren't just developing a royal gut, you were wearing out your liver, your kidneys, your joints. There's mounting evidence that kings like Amenhotep III suffered from morbid obesity, with signs of extreme dental decay and skeletal stress from carrying their own weight. His statues, some of which show him looking bloated and heavy-lidded, might not be as idealised as we once thought. There's a debate among scholars about whether these kings actually enjoyed the food, or were caught in a cultural system where refusing excess was tantamount to blasphemy. Some Egyptologists argue that constant indulgence was a form of religious performance. To feast was to honour the gods, to be full was to embody divine completeness. But others say the kings were just like us when faced with a bottomless buffet. Weak. After all, when your entire court is built to serve you, when your kitchen staffs are hundreds of people strong, and when nobody tells you no, it's easy to believe that the next roast goose is exactly what your soul needs. This culture of overfeeding wasn't accidental. Food was power. And power meant visibility. That's why banquets were public affairs, often held in the palace courtyards where scribes recorded everything. Even the leftovers had meaning. They were redistributed to temples, servants, guests and officials, reinforcing the idea that the king's abundance blessed everyone else. If a pharaoh had enough to waste, that meant the gods were smiling on Egypt. So waste they did. And here's a fun, or horrifying detail. Food offerings weren't just for the living. Tombs were stocked with hundreds of clay jars of wine, baskets of bread, and model animals to provide the same diet in the afterlife. Even in death, the royal stomach expected to be constantly full. Imagine packing for eternity and deciding what you want is a permanent state of meat sweats. That might make you wonder, if all this food was symbolic, maybe they didn't actually eat it all, right? Maybe the banquets were more ceremonial. Unfortunately, evidence says otherwise. The calcified arteries, the abdominal fat deposits, and the worn joints don't lie. They didn't just serve the food, they devoured it. Now, lean back a little and imagine that. A life where every meal is more performance than sustenance, where chewing is almost a duty, where fullness is equated with virtue, is kind of beautiful, and also a little tragic, because beneath the gold and the grandeur was a slow-motion health crisis, and nobody saw it coming, mostly because they were too busy passing the gravy. Now, let's take a slow walk past the feast and into the storage rooms, the royal pantries of ancient Egypt. You can almost smell the cool, musty air of the granaries. These aren't your cosy kitchen cabinets. These are massive vaulted storehouses built into temple complexes and palace foundations, filled floor to ceiling with clay jars, baskets and crates. Rows upon rows of goods: barley, emmer wheat, dried figs, honey sealed in beeswax, amphorae of wine and beer, salted meats and spices from lands most Egyptians never even knew existed. Welcome to the ancient warehouse of divine indulgence. Here's the wild part. Not all of this food was just for the pharaoh to eat directly. Much of it was intended as offerings to the gods. But who controlled those offerings? Who received the best portions of that bounty before it ever touched a shrine? You guessed it. The pharaoh and his temple elite. In theory, this was divine redistribution. In practice, it was a loophole for daily gluttony. You move deeper into the temple kitchens, where hot stones radiate under ceramic cookpots, and the air is thick with the scent of onions frying in oil. Imported oil, mind you, because pharaohs didn't cook with just any grease. Even the fat had to be exotic. The temple complex at Karnak, for example, had its own agricultural estate. Fields, vineyards, cattle herds, and fishing docks. These produced not just food, but elite food, cultivated for rituals and for royal mouths. This wasn't a food system built for sustenance, it was built for status. And when you're a living god, your appetite is considered sacred. So anything you consume takes on spiritual significance. That includes that third helping of roast goose, that extra cup of date wine, that sweet cake glazed with honey and lotus syrup. Over time, this divinely sanctioned overconsumption created what modern scholars sometimes call temple obesity, a condition not just of the king, but of priests and elite scribes who are also enjoying the divine leftovers. But here's a bizarre and fascinating detail. Many temples kept detailed food accounting records. Written in ink on shards of pottery or etched into stone, These documents list what was stored, what was cooked, and who received portions. In some, you see absurd quantities, thousands of loaves per day, entire herds of cattle sacrificed in a month, barrels of wine consumed during a single festival. It's like reading the grocery bill for a god with a serious emotional eating problem. And if you're wondering whether food security was a concern, it was, but only for the lower classes. For the pharaoh and his inner circle, famine was theoretical. The massive storerooms were not just insurance against bad harvests, they were also hoarding stations, ensuring the royal diet never skipped a beat. Even in years when the Nile didn't flood properly and peasants went hungry, the king ate like nothing had changed. That disconnect wasn't just callousness, it was built into the ideology. If the king was weak, the state was weak. So he had to eat strong, even if his people starved. One particularly haunting example comes from the reign of Pepi II. During his incredibly long rule, reportedly over 90 years, there were several documented famines, yet records from temple granaries show uninterrupted feasting and lavish offerings. Scholars debate whether this reflects hoarded resources or just artistic propaganda, but either way, it paints a picture of a ruler who lived high while his people died low. Now, let's touch on one of the more fringe ideas bouncing around scholarly circles, that the centralised food system may have unintentionally created a cultural food addiction among the elite. With such a steady stream of rich, carb-heavy and fat-laden foods, some researchers suggest a pattern of neurological dependence might have formed. Dopamine pathways are dopamine pathways, whether you're binging on Netflix or date wine. Of course, we can't hook a mummy up to a brain scan, but some argue the behavioural patterns, ritualised feasting, secrecy around food reserves, obsessive record-keeping hint at something deeper than just indulgence. But it's not all doom and gloom in the pantry. There's also the quiet brilliance of the Egyptian food logistics system. These people managed to feed thousands of priests, officials and temple workers daily, with relatively little spoilage. They mastered food preservation, salting, drying, fermenting. They even had a crude version of refrigeration, deep underground storage pits that stayed cooler during the blazing summer. They created value systems around bread and beer as currency, paying labourers in rations. This was a society that took its calories very, very seriously. And that brings us to another important layer, the symbolism of abundance. You know how in some modern cultures, having a full fridge is a mark of success? In ancient Egypt, having overflowing granaries wasn't just wealth, it was divine favour. If your fields yielded so much grain that rats couldn't keep up, the gods clearly loved you. And if your temple pantry was bursting at the seams, that meant your king was ruling righteously. In this way, food became not just sustenance, but proof of cosmic alignment. Even tombs got in on the action. Inside the burial chamber of King Tut, archaeologists found containers of preserved meat, wine and bread, all lovingly packed for his afterlife journey. Some of these offerings were wrapped in linen and labelled, like divine Tupperware. And when these were analysed thousands of years later, researchers found high fat content, lots of salt, and even traces of preservatives, some of which may have been toxic in high quantities. So not only was Tut eating rich in life, he was expected to continue that diet into eternity, even if it slowly embalmed him from the inside. By the way, here's a little weird detail for dessert. Some temples kept a kind of sacred food menu that dictated the exact number of loaves or wine jars to offer on specific days. Some days required offerings of 3 of cakes, 1 for each day of the year. Did anyone eat them? Probably not all, but you can imagine the leftovers making their way back to the palace. Because let's be real, what living god is going to pass up a tray of celestial cupcakes? So here you are, in a temple pantry that smells faintly of aging wheat and fermented dates. You touch a jar still sealed with clay. The idea that someone 3,000 years ago opened this, ladled out the thick, sweet contents, and considered it holy food, that sticks with you. You start to see the pharaoh's diet not just as a matter of appetite, but of identity. Every bite reinforced his role as the eternal provider, the cosmic middleman between gods and grain. And slowly, with every feast and every barrel of honey, the body of the king, bloated, aching, sacred, became a temple of its own, overfed and overburdened, but still glittering in gold. Let's be honest, you're probably already side-eyeing that ancient Egyptian bread. Dense, sandy, and about as carb-loaded as a brick of lasagna, it was the cornerstone of the pharaoh's diet. And it's not just bread. As you step into the rhythm of daily royal meals, you realise something very strange. Almost everything they ate was either bread-based or fermented. Beer and bread over and over again, until your gut starts crying out for a salad that won't show up for about 3 millennia. You might think, that doesn't sound too bad, but you haven't lived through the digestive consequences yet. Start with bread. In the royal kitchens, bakers pounded away at grain that had been ground between stone slabs, quern stones, leaving behind tiny flecks of quartz and grit in the flour. So not only was Pharaoh stuffing himself with heavy loaves made from emmer wheat and barley, but he was basically sandpapering his teeth with every bite. Mummies have been found with ground-down molars, dental abscesses, and infections likely caused by years of chewing bread that was part meal, part exfoliant. Then there was beer. Not the fizzy stuff you crack open during a game, but a cloudy, porridge-like brew made from half-baked bread and water. It was thick, nutritious, and often consumed with a straw to avoid gulping down chunks of floating grain. If that sounds gross, remember, this was considered a staple. In fact, it was sometimes the main source of calories for Egyptians. For the pharaohs, beer wasn't just daily hydration, it was sourd, ceremonial even. They drank it during offerings, festivals, and probably just because they could. And since it was full of unfiltered carbs and sugars, it did more than quench thirst. It added bulk. A lot of bulk. And let's not forget how often these two showed up on the royal table. Bread and beer were consumed at every meal. Morning, a sweet roll and a jug of beer. Midday snack, a barley cake with a honey dip and you guessed it, more beer. Dinner, some meat, a big pile of bread and fermented barley juice to wash it all down. It's the kind of repetitive diet that might seem peasant-level basic, except that in royal quantities it becomes lethal. Here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Modern analysis of Egyptian mummy remains, including pharaohs, reveals advanced signs of arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, and other chronic issues that we now associate with metabolic syndrome. Their rich bread, beer, meat-heavy diet, paired with very little physical activity, turned their insides into a kind of nutritional disaster zone. In fact, one mummy showed signs of a massive heart attack at around 40 years old. Middle age, royal wealth, endless bread, and a coronary time bomb ticking behind the gilded throne. And yet culturally this diet wasn't just acceptable, it was idealized. Food was abundance, abundance was divine favour, so a plump pharaoh wasn't a health concern, he was a blessing made visible. You, sitting there in the court, wouldn't dare suggest a food pyramid. You'd nod and refill his goblet, even as he slowly expanded like an overripe fig. Now, you might be thinking, didn't they have any variety? Yes, technically. They had legumes, fruits, and the occasional vegetable, but these weren't prioritised in the royal menu. They were backup singers. The stars were always the same, bread and beer, bread and beer. The logic was, why waste your divine palate on something as humble as lentils when you could chew on a honey-soaked barley cake the size of your fist? Still, there were moments when the monotony broke. Special feasts, for example, introduced spice-laced dishes, imported fruits like pomegranates and sycamore figs, and experimental breads dyed with saffron or made into shapes of animals. But that was rare flair, like getting dessert sushi in a fast food world. Most days even kings had routine, and that routine was very, very carb-heavy. There's actually a fringe theory, tucked in the footnotes of some scholarly debates, that the pharaohs may have suffered from early insulin resistance. Not exactly type 2 diabetes as we know it, but a metabolic tipping point brought on by constant high glycemic eating. They didn't have glucometers, of course, but we do. And when you simulate their diet, modern nutritionists have noticed dramatic spikes in blood sugar, followed by sluggish crashes. Sound familiar? You're basically watching the birth of the royal sugar crash, with no couch or Netflix to recover on. Now picture this in ritual form. The Sed festival, for instance, a ceremonial renewal of the king's power held after 30 years of rule, involved massive offerings of bread and beer distributed to priests and court officials. The pharaoh, by tradition, would participate in athletic displays to prove his vitality. But how athletic can you be after decades of barley loaf binging and a liver that probably glows with sugar buildup? Historians quietly suspect that in many cases, these runs were staged or performed by stand-ins, or shortened, or just faked entirely. A divine jog-by. And this is where another scholarly debate opens up. Some say the pharaoh's physical decline wasn't just due to excess food, but to a culture of ceremonial repetition. a diet built not for nutrients, but for symbolism. Bread and beer meant life. They were the sustenance of Ma'at, the cosmic order, so changing them, even for health, would have been unthinkable. Imagine going up to a pharaoh and suggesting a quinoa salad. You'd be mummified on the spot for blasphemy. As you drift through this image of royal repetition, your mind lingers on the smell. Warm, sweet, slightly sour from fermentation. It's oddly comforting, but beneath it, there's a dull ache, a weight, a sense that something in the system is bloated, beyond repair. You realise the pharaoh, in all his golden glory, is shackled to this daily ritual as much as anyone. Every bite is expectation, every sip is theatre. And the real tragedy? He might have been just as tired of the bread and beer as you are. You stretch out in your mind's eye, reclining just a little on a cushion, embroidered with lotus flowers, your feet on cool alabaster tiles, watching the daily spectacle unfold. There's no TV here, just ritual, hierarchy, and a dazzling show of power woven into every movement. The pharaoh sits at the centre of it all, not just as a ruler, but as something far more dangerous, a god. And when you're a god, no one questions your eating habits. You don't count calories, you don't answer to doctors, you answer only to the cosmos, and even that's more suggestion than rule. This divine status wasn't just symbolic. The pharaoh was believed to be the literal earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon wool, and upon death, a merger with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. As such, his body was sacred. Every aspect of his existence, from the clothes he wore to the food he consumed, reinforced this divine identity. So when the pharaoh indulged, it wasn't gluttony, it was cosmic affirmation. Eating excessively, drinking deeply, and lounging in gold-threaded linens. That wasn't sloth, that was ritual. And here's where it gets twisted. Because if you're divine, you're also untouchable. If your stomach growls, servants run. If you want roast duck for breakfast and honey cakes shaped like sacred beetles, it happens. If you crave imported wine from the Levant, teams of labourers and traders swing into motion. There's no fasting, no moderation, just the steady hum of fulfillment, orchestrated like a symphony that never ends. Over time, indulgence becomes expectation. Expectation becomes tradition. Tradition becomes sacred law. But the cost? Oh, it builds quietly. Beneath the perfume and praise, the body of the god-king begins to groan. Joint pain flares, skin becomes inflamed. The once proud warrior posture softens into the slouch of someone who rarely walks more than a few feet at a time. His world is too scented, too padded, too slow, and the tragic part is, the more pain he feels, the more indulgence he seeks. Warm wine dulls the ache. Sweet bread fills the hollow. Somewhere in that temple-sized dining room, comfort becomes a cage. There's a strange duality here. To the outside world, the pharaoh is perfection. Strong, radiant, chosen. But within the palace walls, he might be waddling more than striding. The priests still chant his praises while slipping him another lamb kebab. Sculptors idealize him in stone, chiseled, poised, youthful, even as he leans on a cane behind the scenes. No one dares depict the bloated face, the swollen feet, the irritability that comes from a life of constant digestion and zero accountability. And it wasn't just one pharaoh. This was a systemic indulgence, woven into centuries of royal life. Successive rulers inherited not just the throne, but the behaviours attached to it. If your father, grandfather and great-grandfather all consumed divine banquets twice daily, you weren't about to switch to grilled vegetables and water. That would be heresy. That would be weakness. And weakness had no place on the throne of Horus. What's interesting is that this idea of divine consumption didn't stop at food. Everything the pharaoh touched or used was elevated to the realm of the gods. His clothes weren't just fine, they were blessed. His furniture wasn't just comfortable, it was designed according to sacred geometries. His food, of course, was no different. Each meal was a mini ritual, bread baked in specific shapes, meat prepared with incense-smoked herbs, wine poured in exacting quantities depending on the occasion. It wasn't just excess, it was excess with a script. Take, for example, the Temple of Karnak's kitchen records. In one preserved list, a daily allocation for the high priest of Amun, who operated more or less like a pharaoh's food double, included 8 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of beer, 1 portion of goose, honeyed cakes, and a pomegranate every day, and that was just breakfast. If that's what the priest got, you can only imagine what the divine stomach was digesting at the same time. There's also something distinctly performative about all this. The pharaoh's appetite became another way of displaying control. If you could sit calmly and consume a 5-course meal while your people fasted or laboured in the sun, you were more than human. You were above pain, above need, and above the rules that applied to lesser men. This performative indulgence was captured in festival scenes where food flowed endlessly and the pharaoh sat motionless, sphinx-like, as entertainment unrolled before him. Dancers, acrobats, musicians. It wasn't just luxury, it was political theatre. Of course, not all scholars buy into the image of the constantly overfed pharaoh. Some argue the most bloated depictions come from later dynasties, when Egypt was past its peak and clinging to splendour as its last defence. They suggest early kings, like those of the Old Kingdom, may have led more physically active lives, leading expeditions, building monuments, performing rituals personally. But as the state grew richer and more insulated, so did its rulers. Eventually, divine status stopped being a duty and became an excuse. One thing that adds to the confusion is the role of art. Egyptian artistic convention favoured idealisation. Muscular arms, straight spines, sharp profiles. But every now and then cracks show. A statue with sagging cheeks, a painting where the belly bulges just a little too roundly. These accidental truths suggest that beneath the aesthetic rules, real bodies told different stories. Heavier stories, slower stories. And that brings us to the role of silence. In a court where the king's word was law, who would ever dare suggest dietary restraint? The royal physicians might have been aware of the consequences. Many texts show sophisticated knowledge of digestion, organ function, and even diabetes-like symptoms. But could they speak up? Doubtful. Advising moderation to a divine being could be seen as an insult, even dangerous. So the doctors stuck to herbal remedies, massages and spells treating the symptoms without touching the source. You settle back in your imaginary throne and feel the weight of it all. Not just the food, but the expectations. To be divine meant never hungering, never declining, never aging, at least not in public. And yet the body doesn't care about dogma. It bloats, it inflames, it fails. The pharaoh might rule the land, command armies and talk with gods, but inside his pancreas is waving a tiny white flag. The sun hangs high above the Nile, and somewhere deep inside a temple complex, a sacred ritual begins. You're not invited technically, but let's pretend you're a royal fly on the wall. In the inner sanctuary, priests move like shadows across polished stone, offering loaves of bread and clay jugs of wine to the gods. They chant, sprinkle incense, and raise their arms in solemn invocation. But here's the kicker. None of these divine offerings will remain on the altar for long. Once the ceremony ends and the gods have consumed the essence of the food, all those sacred snacks are hauled off to be eaten by humans. Specifically the priests, and even more specifically, the pharaoh himself. This wasn't an act of charity. It was part of the plan. See, in ancient Egypt, divine offerings weren't wasted. After the gods were symbolically nourished, the leftovers were distributed among the temple staff and the palace elite. The best cuts were reserved for the highest ranks, starting with the living god king. So the pharaoh wasn't just gorging himself from his own kitchen, he was also snacking on meals meant for Ra, Osiris and Thoth. If there was a divine refrigerator, the pharaoh had first dibs on everything inside. This system, called reversion of offerings, wasn't a glitch in the matrix. It was an accepted part of temple life. Offerings flowed from the people to the gods, and then back to the ruling class in a kind of celestial recycling loop. It reinforced the pharaoh's role as mediator between heaven and earth, while also reinforcing his waistline. If you're wondering how a religious ritual turns into a high-calorie snack break, well, welcome to ancient theocracy. Let's say a festival's happening, maybe the beautiful Feast of the Valley or the Opet Festival. These events involved massive public processions, boat parades, and, you guessed it, food. Enormous amounts of it. Bread by the basket load, oxen roasted whole, rivers of beer flowing like the actual Nile. Priests offered it all up to the gods in solemn ceremony. Then, like kids after a birthday party, they got to take the cake home. And for the pharaoh, he wasn't just the honoured guest. He was often considered the physical recipient of the gods' gifts. In practice, that meant another excuse to feast, another divine justification to indulge. But not all food was created equal. certain offerings carried special significance. For example, the Hetep Dinesu formula, inscribed on countless tomb walls, specifically listed what kinds of food the deceased should receive eternally: bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen. It was believed the gods themselves favoured this menu. And if it was good enough for the gods, it was absolutely good enough for a pharaoh. No room for moderation when your grocery list is sacred scripture. Now here's a quirky side note. Some temples were essentially the earliest food courts. They operated their own bakeries, breweries, and butcheries. Staffed by hundreds of labourers and cooks, they could prepare and distribute food at a staggering scale. In one record from the reign of Seti I, offerings included over 12,000 loaves of bread and hundreds of jars of beer in a single day. It's unclear how much of that made it to divine consumption, but we know what happened after. The reversion began, and guess who got the best share? This gets even more layered when you realise that being fed by the gods wasn't just a luxury. It was a marker of spiritual purity. The idea was that if you consumed food that had been sanctified, you were absorbing divine essence. That made you not just well-fed, but cosmically enhanced. The priests used this logic to justify their share, and for the pharaoh it only amplified his image as a living god. He wasn't just ruling Egypt, he was spiritually devouring it bite by bite. Of course, this created a feedback loop. The more sacred food you consumed, the holier you became. The holier you became, the more offerings you received. And the more offerings you received, well, you get it. It's a cycle of divine snacking that no ancient Fitbit could survive. The body of the king slowly became a bloated vessel of sanctity, weighed down by the very system that declared him transcendent. Some scholars wonder if this system created quiet resentment among the non-elite. While farmers scraped together onions and lentils, the king and his priests feasted on roast goose and sweet wine on behalf of the gods. Did anyone dare complain? Publicly no, but graffiti tucked away on temple walls occasionally offers sarcastic jabs at the priesthood's indulgence. One shard of ostrakon features a crude drawing of a bloated priest being fanned by servants, captioned with what loosely translates to, "The god's stomach is always full." And the pharaoh? He probably didn't even blink. From his perspective, this wasn't overconsumption, it was ritual fulfillment. His body was the vessel through which cosmic balance flowed. If that meant he needed to eat 6 roasted ducks and a gallon of beer to maintain order in the universe, so be it. Pass the duck. Now, not everyone in the scholarly world agrees on the scale of this divine gluttony. Some argue that offerings were shared so widely across temple staff that the pharaoh's personal intake was minimal. Others believe these reversion meals became so normalised they lost their spiritual punch and just became part of court life. But the physical evidence, the fatty tissues in mummies, the worn teeth, the calcified arteries, suggests someone was doing more than just nibbling at the sacred buffet. You imagine now the quiet echo of sandals on stone, the scent of roasting meat drifting up to the high ceilings of a dark, cool temple chamber. Gold glints off painted columns. A priest lifts a loaf of bread to a statue of Amun, and moments later, the same loaf is whisked away, sliced, and served to someone who's already eaten 6 others just like it. The gods were watching, sure, but the real mouth getting fed wasn't stone. This was a world where eating wasn't just biological, it was theological. The pharaoh wasn't obese because he lacked restraint. He was obese because restraint itself would have been heresy. The bigger the feast, the stronger the connection to the divine, and slowly, silently, the gods fattened their chosen king, not with wrath, but with reverence. You step outside the palace walls now, away from the incense-thick air and silver platters, and onto the hard-packed dust of an ancient Egyptian village. The sun beats down, the Nile glistens in the distance, and everything smells like sweat, earth, and effort. You're no longer royalty. You're no longer divine. You're just one of the millions of people who made the empire run, from sunrise to exhaustion. And unlike the pharaoh, you're not eating honey-soaked goose or chugging ceremonial beer from alabaster goblets. You're lucky if you get onions, lentils, and maybe some mouldy flatbread that hasn't fossilised your molars yet. The contrast is staggering. At the very top of society, the pharaoh sits heavy with power, food, and ritual. And down here, the labourers carry stones, harvest grain, and press wine for temples they're never allowed to enter. Their diets are lean not by choice but by necessity. Bread, yes, but of the lowest quality, often made with the sweepings of the granary floor. Beer too, but weak and watery. meat, maybe once a year, a festival, a wedding, or, ironically, a temple surplus redistribution. While the king's body swells with privilege, theirs shrinks from toil. Archaeological digs at worker villages, like the settlement near the Giza pyramids, show exactly what this looked like. Skeletons of labourers often bear signs of malnutrition, joint stress and stunted growth, teeth worn down to the gum line, broken bones that never healed properly. And yet the same dig sites reveal nearby granaries overflowing with royal provisions, sealed jars, untouched and pristine, clearly reserved for someone far above their pay grade. The difference wasn't just economic, it was metaphysical. Egyptians believed in Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. And Ma'at said that some people served and others ruled. The pharaoh was at the top because the gods put him there. His comfort was your burden. His belly was your spiritual tax. You didn't question it. You internalized it. You carved it into temple walls. You built monuments to it. Still, it's hard not to see the cracks, especially when you look at burial sites. The tomb of a farmer might have a handful of pottery jars, a little bread and a few amulets, small tokens for the afterlife. Meanwhile, the royal tomb is stuffed to the vaulted ceiling with roast meats, barrels of beer, golden dishes and animal sacrifices. One study of New Kingdom tombs noted that a single noble's burial contained more food offerings than an entire village consumed in a month. All that for a man who was already dead. Now imagine being alive, watching those offerings carried past your mud brick house. You smell the spices, you hear the music, you see the goose fat glistening on polished trays, but you don't taste it, not unless someone upstream in the priesthood spills a little too much wine or cuts an extra slice. Resentment, maybe, but mostly it's just life. In ancient Egypt, food was fate. Here's a particularly sharp detail. Statues of pharaohs and nobles often showed them holding bread and beer in both hands. Not tools, not weapons, not symbols of governance. Just carbs and barley. These were the sacred objects of power, the tools of divine rule. If you were lucky enough to get a depiction like that carved into your tomb, it meant you had made it. You weren't just well fed in life, you planned to keep the party going in death. But let's not idealise the peasant diet too much. While it was less rich, it wasn't healthy in the modern sense. Constant labour without enough protein led to stunted growth and early ageing. Still, statistically, peasants showed fewer signs of obesity-related disease, fewer calcified arteries, fewer gouty joints. In a weird twist of fate, the kings were dying from too much abundance, while the farmers were dying from the lack of it. This imbalance wasn't just physical, it became symbolic. The fatter the king grew, the more it meant he was protected by the gods. His gut was not a health warning, it was divine endorsement. Even temple art started to exaggerate this, especially in the late periods. Statuettes and reliefs began to show royals with heavier frames, softer chins and fuller limbs. It wasn't mockery, it was reverence. A plump king was a blessed king. Now, not every scholar agrees on this interpretation. Some argue that the ideal male figure in Egyptian art remained fairly lean, even into the Ptolemaic period. Others point out that many fat depictions actually show fertility gods or specific mythological figures, not real rulers. But the physical evidence, those scans of royal mummies, those fragile inflamed joints, tell a stubborn story. These weren't sculpted warrior kings dying in battle. These were men slowly crushed under the weight of ritual, power and roast duck. Even within the palace there was hierarchy. High officials and scribes might share in the sacred offerings, but always at the pharaoh's mercy. A vizier might be allowed half a goose. A chief priest might sip from the same wine batch as the king, but no one outate the pharaoh. His plate was the ultimate symbol of his role in the cosmic machine. One fringe theory suggests this stratification was intentional, not just to display power, but to preserve it. A heavier king moved less, needed more servants, required a tighter circle of trust. Obesity, in this interpretation, wasn't just a symptom, it was a strategy. Keep the king comfortable, immobile, dependent. The more indulgence he needed, the more stable the system became. Whether or not that's true, it's a chilling thought, that a bloated ruler was somehow safer. So here you sit, in the dust, watching the parade of platters pass by. You know you won't taste what they carry, you know your own dinner will be bland and modest, but still, you watch. Still, you nod. Because this is the order of things, and maybe, just maybe, When you die, someone will leave you a clay pot of beer and a stale loaf for the journey beyond. It's not a golden sarcophagus, but at least it won't give you heart disease. You're back in the royal tomb again, only this time it's not candlelight or superstition guiding you. It's fluorescent lighting, a sterile medical lab, and the figure on the table, half unwrapped and decades older than any known civilization still standing, is the star of a different kind of ritual, the autopsy, or more specifically, the CT scan. Tonight's pharaoh isn't reciting spells or commissioning temples. He's being digitally dissected one scan at a time, and what we're learning about him is unpleasant. You peer at the screen, a mummy, once regal and wrapped in the finest linen, now glows faintly in cross-section. And there it is, arterial calcification, the telltale signature of advanced heart disease, the kind of thing your modern doctor might find after decades of cheeseburgers and desk jobs. But this is ancient Egypt. There are no trans fats, no fast food, just beer, bread, meat, and more bread. Yet here he lies with his blood vessels turned to stone. And it's not just one case. Over the past 2 decades, teams of scientists have scanned dozens of royal and noble mummies, from the 18th dynasty all the way through the Greco-Roman period. Time and time again they find the same patterns: arterial blockages, enlarged hearts, signs of hypertension. Even King Tutankhamun, the boy king who barely reached adulthood, shows signs of bone and joint damage, likely from inherited disease, but some suspect dietary factors played a role too. His left foot was clubbed, his spine curved, his teeth decayed, his soft palate swollen. These aren't just genetic quirks, they're markers of inflammation and systemic strain. You begin to understand the tomb was the final stop in a long, slow journey of physical breakdown. Beneath the gold and the grandeur, these bodies were failing quietly and painfully, and no one could or would stop it. One especially grim finding came from a scan of the mummy of Pharaoh Meremptah, son of Ramses II. His arteries were so hardened, they were visible in the scan like chalk-white ribbons. Researchers called it a textbook case of atherosclerosis. He likely experienced chronic chest pain. He might have suffered a heart attack, and yet no record of this pain exists. The art shows him smiling, striding, victorious. His reality probably involved gasping for breath between bites of roast goose. You have to wonder, did they know they were sick? Ancient Egyptian medicine was advanced in some ways. They had diagnoses for over 200 conditions. They understood symptoms of heart distress, even if they didn't know what a heart attack was. Medical papyri describe a heat in the chest or heaviness in the left arm, signs modern doctors would recognise immediately. The problem is, these symptoms were usually attributed to magic or divine imbalance, not diet. You didn't need less bread. You needed an amulet, a prayer, a spell to drive out the demon that lived behind your ribs. And so the cycle continued. The pharaohs ate, they prayed, they ruled, they decayed. Let's throw in a quirky little twist. Some royal mummies have been found with actual food remnants in their intestinal tracts. That's right. Using endoscopy-like tech, researchers have examined preserved stomach contents and found recognisable remnants of bread, meat, and even plant fibres. One mummy had so much partially digested food still inside him that scientists suggested he died shortly after an enormous meal. You're picturing it now, aren't you? A final supper so large it accompanied him into eternity, uneaten but undeniably present. But even in death, the optics had to be controlled. Mummification was a kind of sacred cover-up. As bodies decayed, or were already damaged from disease, embalmers stepped in with linen, resin, and creativity. Missing organs? No problem. Stuff in some aromatics. Sunken cheeks? Fill them with packing. Swollen belly? Wrap it tighter. By the time the pharaoh was sealed into his sarcophagus, his body was idealized. Slimmed, sculpted, divine. The afterlife didn't allow for double chins. This raises a fascinating scholarly debate. Some argue that the meticulous preservation of appearance was an admission. They knew their kings were physically declining, and they took pains to hide it. Others think it was simply tradition. Make the king look his best no matter what. But either way, the embalming table became a second throne, one where the frailty of the human body was politely erased for eternity. Then there's the question of legacy. What did future generations of Egyptians think when they saw these mummies? Did they notice the wear and tear? The missing teeth, the broken bones, the bloated limbs? Or were they so caught up in the idea of divinity that the details didn't matter? After all, no one paints a god with gout, no one carves a relief of a king limping to his physician with indigestion, and yet the science doesn't lie. Even the most sacred bodies have fat deposits. Even gods get sick. You find yourself standing in the virtual shadows of these scan rooms, looking at ancient rib cages sliced clean by technology, and you can almost hear them whisper, not in curses, not in riddles, but in symptoms. Pain here, tightness there, a heaviness after eating, a breath that won't come all the way in. It's all so familiar, so modern, so deeply, frustratingly human. The silence surrounding these issues in the ancient world isn't surprising. Chronic illness didn't fit the narrative of the divine perfection, so they erased it, or ignored it. And the pharaohs kept eating, kept expanding, kept dying, and now, millennia later, they've returned not as gods but as patients, diagnosed posthumously, lit up on some of the screens, their secrets spilled not by priests but by radiologists. The irony? These kings, obsessed with immortality, have found it, not through magic but through medical data. Their suffering, scanned and catalogued, becomes a cautionary tale, proof that even gods need fibre. So here you are in the cool hum of a lab, staring at the digital ghost of a king, once worshipped, now deep down studied, once exalted, now dissected, and all because he couldn't resist the bread. Now lean back in your mind for a moment. You're not in the temple or the palace or even a dusty tomb this time. You're in the throne room, and it's eerily quiet. The great pharaoh reclines on a gilded couch, head supported by cushions that probably took 5 different linen workers a week to stitch. A fan bearer stands nearby, barely flicking his palm frond. The king doesn't move, not because he's deep in thought or overwhelmed by statecraft, but because movement hurts. His joints are stiff, his knees grind when he bends, and walking across the room, that's a production. There's no mystery why. The God King hasn't really walked anywhere himself in years. Because here's the thing no one talks about when they're carving history into stone. Ruling Egypt was a sedentary gig. At least for those at the very top. You don't lift a brick, carry a spear, or haul in a fishing net when you can just nod and make someone else do it. The pharaoh's physical world shrinks to a small loop. Bedchamber, bathhouse, banquet hall, throne, repeat. Maybe once in a while a ceremonial walk through the palace courtyard, surrounded by bodyguards, acolytes, and a dozen scribes writing down what he glanced at. But exercise, voluntary movement, that's not part of the royal script. It didn't start that way. Early dynastic pharaohs, back when Egypt was still rough around the edges, were more involved. They inspected canal projects, led military campaigns, maybe even wrestled a lion or two for symbolic bragging rights. But by the time we get into the New Kingdom and beyond, ruling had become more ritual than risk. Pharaohs ruled from a cushion, not a chariot. Their bodies reflected that change. And that sedentary lifestyle. It wasn't just convenience, it was deeply entwined with the ideology of kingship. The pharaoh wasn't supposed to labour. That was for the common people. His stillness was symbolic. He represented order, stability, eternity. You didn't want your divine ruler running around like a farmer. You wanted him serene, posed, and yes, immobile. A human obelisk. But let's be honest, that immobility had consequences. The body needs movement. Without it, muscles atrophy, joints stiffen, and circulation slows. Combined with the rich, heavy diet we've already peeked into, the sedentary lifestyle completed the pharaoh's health disaster trifecta. You get the ancient world's equivalent of modern lifestyle disease, a ruler with inflammation, chronic pain, and legs that probably swelled up like pomegranates by midday. And it wasn't just the king. The upper ranks of court, the high priests, elite scribes, administrators followed the same pattern. Seated jobs, ritual movement on only, days spent hunched over scrolls or reclining in shaded patios, sipping thick wine and discussing tax grain yields. They weren't sprinting through temple corridors or logging 10,000 steps. If they had Fitbits, the things would have died from boredom. There's a particularly telling detail from some tomb inscriptions. The overseer of the House of Leisure. That was a real title. Imagine that, someone was literally in charge of making sure rest happened efficiently. Think of it like a personal trainer, but for naps. The ancient elite didn't just rest, they optimized it. Meanwhile, their cardiovascular systems were quietly waving red flags. We don't need to guess about the impact. The physical signs are right there in the mummies. Shrinking muscle mass, degenerative bone conditions, signs of gout, and inflammatory arthritis often caused by diets high in purines, found in meat and alcohol. Several royal mummies show joint damage consistent with this. You can almost imagine the king wincing as he shifted on his throne, but smiling for the crowd because to frown would break the illusion. Scholars sometimes debate whether this level of sedentariness was absolute. After all, the said festival required the king to perform ritual running to prove his continued vitality. But again, was that really him running? Or was it more like a brisk shuffle performed by a body double, while the crowd cheered and the king waved from a shaded platform? The truth may never be confirmed, but let's just say no one was handing out Olympic medals. In some reliefs, you see pharaohs portrayed in dynamic poses, arms raised in triumph, chariot wheels spinning behind them. But these are symbols, not snapshots. The real day-to-day pharaoh probably moved like a man who'd eaten 2 geese and a pitcher of date wine for breakfast. Slowly, carefully, with help. This leads to another under-discussed issue: pain. With sedentary habits and heavy eating come chronic conditions: back pain, joint inflammation, bloating. The ancient Egyptian medical texts do reference these symptoms, but again, they're usually chalked up to spiritual causes. A king in pain didn't need to change his lifestyle. He needed a spell. Maybe a massage with sacred oils, maybe a ritual performed by the high priest of Sekhmet. But never a suggestion to, say, take a walk or skip second breakfast. And yes, this created a weird disconnect, because even as the king's body slowed and sagged, his image stayed forever youthful. Art locked him in his prime. So what happens when a civilization insists its god-king is ageless, but the guy himself can barely make it up the stairs? You get what some call ritual accommodation. That's the scholarly way of saying they started faking it. Ceremonies were shortened, stairs replaced with ramps, appearances staged, everything done to maintain the illusion of divine health while the royal body told a very mortal story. One strange fringe theory even suggests that some kings eventually lived almost entirely within palace walls, not for security, but because they physically couldn't handle travel. Their mobility was so limited their world shrank to a few carefully constructed spaces. Ramps, shaded walkways, private seating platforms. The palace wasn't just a symbol of power, it was an ancient accessibility aid. And so the pharaoh sits, still and swollen in his glory, a symbol of divine stillness, a prisoner of golden inertia. Around him, dancers twirl, priests chant, servants hustle, but the king does not move. He watches, he nods, he feasts, but his body is quietly turning against him. And you, still lounging in your imagined linen tunic, realize something uncomfortable. In ancient Egypt, stillness was holiness, but also the slow march of decline. A body that doesn't move eventually stops altogether, even when it's divine. You're staring at a sarcophagus now, ancient wood lacquered in resins, painted with gold leaf and lapis, eyes forever open. It's another king, another god in human form, swaddled in layer after layer of linen and myth. But tonight, you're not here to admire the artwork. You're wondering something oddly modern. Did this guy have diabetes? It sounds ridiculous, right? Diabetes, an affliction of vending machines and bad breakfast choices, tucked away in the entrails of a king who ruled 3,000 years before the word insulin was ever whispered. And yet the evidence is compelling. That bloated belly, the discoloured, puffy feet, the swollen tissues found beneath the bandages. These are more than just quirks of preservation. They're possible signs of metabolic distress. A system overloaded by sugar, strained by fat, and left to spiral slowly into dysfunction. Of course, we can't confirm ancient diabetes with the precision we can today. There's no blood to test, no glucose monitor you can stick on a mummy. But you can work backwards, compare symptoms, measure tissue calcification, scan organs, and build a forensic profile. And when you do, you start to see it, again and again: obesity, vascular damage, fatty deposits on the heart and liver, pancreas shrinkage, and in a few haunting cases, clear evidence of severe peripheral vascular disease, the kind that, in today's world, would make a doctor raise an eyebrow and say, "How long have you been living like this?" The answer: a while. Because the pharaohs didn't just dabble in sweet indulgence, they soaked in it. Date syrup, honey-glazed pastries, sweet beer, overripe fruit, all crammed into a diet without balance. Sugar was a symbol of luxury, not a risk factor. The sweeter the bite, the more blessed the king. Honey was sacred, harvested by temple-controlled beekeepers and stored like treasure. It wasn't used sparingly, it was slathered, poured, baked into everything. Imagine pouring honey over honey-drenched bread and chasing it with sweet beer. That wasn't dessert, that was breakfast. Some scholars now argue that while type 2 diabetes itself can't be clinically confirmed in these mummies, they likely experienced the same symptoms: chronic fatigue, excessive urination, numb limbs, vision problems. There's even speculation that some pharaohs' odd eye shapes in art may reflect ocular complications from high sugar intake. It's fringe stuff, sure, but the pattern persists. One particularly eerie case is Queen Hatshepsut. Her mummy, misidentified for years, eventually revealed a cascade of health issues. Obese with poor circulation, diseased bones, and possible signs of diabetes, she also had skin lesions that may have been aggravated by unregulated sugar levels. Combined with the toxic lotion found in her tomb, meant to soothe, but likely made things worse, her body became a kind of tragic encyclopedia of metabolic decline. But it wasn't just sugar, it was the whole package. The meats, the wines, the sedentary lifestyle. It all worked together to destabilize the body. Ancient physicians, though skilled, simply didn't have the framework to see what was happening. They called it imbalance of the humours, or a disturbance in the heart's essence. Some medical papyri recommend a diet of crushed sycamore figs or ground pomegranate skin for excessive thirst and sweet urine, phrases that today scream diabetic symptoms. But without insulin, without understanding the role of the pancreas or blood sugar levels, these remedies were basically spiritual first aid. Imagine being the pharaoh and slowly realizing that something's wrong. You're tired all the time. You're thirsty, unreasonably so. You have to excuse yourself during ceremonies just to pee. Your vision blurs, your skin itches. But no one says the word, no one can. The priests just offer more ointments. The physicians rub you with oils. The servants bring stronger wine to numb the ache. No one dares to tell a god he's sick. And if you're thinking, well, wouldn't someone notice the king was slowly dying? They did. They just framed it differently. Disease was not a medical problem, but a cosmic one. It meant your care, your spiritual double, was distressed. Maybe you offended a god. Maybe your dead ancestors were angry. Maybe you needed more prayers, not fewer pastries. That brings us to the heart of the debate. Some historians argue that what we're seeing in these mummies, especially the signs of arterial disease, obesity, and possibly diabetes, is the world's earliest evidence of lifestyle-related illness in a ruling class. But others push back. They say these symptoms could result from genetics, environmental toxins, or mummification processes that distort the evidence. Resin soaking, for instance, can shrink organs or mask tissue damage. Honey and oil embalming techniques might cause fat to pool unnaturally. So is it disease, or just bad post-mortem optics? Still, the growing body of evidence, literally royal body after royal body, leans toward one conclusion. Something was systematically hurting these rulers, and it wasn't war or assassination. It was their dinner. And maybe, just maybe, they suspected it. Maybe some pharaoh, sitting under the weight of his own robes, noticed how much harder it was to rise from the throne than it used to be. Maybe he looked out at the priesthood just as bloated and lethargic as he was, and thought, this feels wrong. But by then it was tradition, and tradition in Egypt wasn't flexible. It was stone, unchanging, eternal, just like the tombs they built. Gloriite is on the outside, hollow and crumbling within. You sit there now, watching this mummy unwrapped by science, and the tragedy lands in full. The god-kings of Egypt didn't fall by sword or rebellion. They died, slowly and silently, from a life too sweet, too soft, too full. A death by ritual, a death by excess. And somewhere deep beneath that golden mask, you suspect they knew it. You're holding something sticky in your mind's hand now. Golden, viscous, and shimmering in the desert light. It's honey. The Egyptians called it the nectar of the gods, and they meant that literally. Honey wasn't just a sweetener, it was a sacred substance. It healed wounds, preserved meats, and offered a way to taste the divine with every bite. And in the royal court, it flowed like water. Thick, fragrant, and dangerously addictive, honey became one of the secret architects of the pharaoh's undoing. Let's start with the basics. Honey was everywhere. It was baked into breads, whipped into cakes, added to wine, smeared on dried fruits, and even stirred into cosmetics. If something could hold honey, it did. In the kitchens of the palace and temples, it wasn't a garnish, it was the main ingredient. Recipes scribbled on ostraca include instructions for pastries stuffed with dates and drenched in honey, or meat glazed in a sticky syrup of honey, vinegar, and imported herbs. You picture it now, sizzling on a clay grill, the glaze bubbling as it clings to the crisping skin of a goose leg. It smells amazing. It tastes even better. But eat like that every day and suddenly you're a deity with blood sugar problems. Honey was also a prestige item. Beekeeping was managed by specialised workers who maintained hives in reed baskets along the Nile. These weren't backyard setups. They were controlled by the temple economy, which meant the best honey often went to the priests and the pharaoh, not only because they had the power to demand it, but because honey itself was considered pure. Offering honey to the gods? Perfectly acceptable. Eating it as a god? Inevitable. This sacred indulgence went far beyond flavour. Honey was used in embalming mixed with resins and oils to coat the body. It was stuffed into wounds to prevent rot. Applied to the eyes, supposedly to brighten vision. Slathered on the scalp to encourage hair growth. Even used in fertility rites. It was the duct tape of ancient Egyptian luxury. If something was broken, cover it in honey and call it sacred. But no one stopped to think about what this constant exposure, especially ingestion, was doing internally. There's a fringe theory out there, and of course we love a good fringe theory, that royal addiction to honey contributed not just to obesity, but to psychological dependence. Sound far-fetched? Maybe, but honey is high in glucose and fructose, both of which trigger dopamine responses in the brain. When consumed constantly and in massive quantities, like at a pharaoh's daily banquet, it could reinforce compulsive behaviour. The more you eat, the more you crave. Now combine that with no social or religious restrictions, and you've got a system where the royal brain is quietly rewiring itself around sugar. This isn't just speculation. Honey has a long track record of causing physical damage when overconsumed. Modern nutritionists will tell you that it spikes insulin, promotes fat store and storage, and, in excessive amounts, can damage liver and kidney function. And guess what? Royal mummies often show signs of all three. When CT scans revealed fatty liver indications in some New Kingdom rulers, honey was one of the suspected culprits. Not the only one, obviously. There were plenty of suspects at this crime scene, but definitely a key accomplice. But in Egypt, the more honey you had, the more powerful you were. It was a luxury substance. Poor farmers might never taste it. Commoners, maybe a teaspoon once a year during a festival. But the king? He bathed in it metaphorically, and maybe literally. There are descriptions in temple inscriptions of divine cleansing rituals involving honey, lotus oil, and milk. Sounds like a spa day. Until you realise what that does to a skin already inflamed by poor circulation and metabolic strain. And here's a sad detail. Honey was used in offerings to the gods to ensure sweetness in the afterlife. Mummies were buried with jars of honey, literally. Some archaeologists opened tombs and found clay pots sealed for thousands of years, still full of golden, edible honey. You could dip your finger in it right now if you weren't worried about ancient curses. That's how important it was. Honey didn't just flavour the king's life, it flavoured his eternity. This ritualization of sweetness created a kind of spiritual sugar dependency. Sweet meant sacred. Bitter meant suffering. And so everything that passed the royal lips had to be touched by sugar, either through honey or fruits like dates and sycamore figs. There's a beautiful irony here. In trying to make everything in their lives divine and pleasurable, the kings slowly poisoned themselves. Not dramatically, not in an overdose during a feast kind of way, but slowly, gently, day by day. A spoonful of honey at a time. Some medical papyri even hint at problems that sound suspiciously like sugar-related disease. Writings describe thick blood, constant thirst, sweet urine, and weakness in the limbs, all signs of what we now recognise as diabetic conditions. The treatments, spells, diet adjustments, sort of, and honey itself. Yes, honey was often used as a treatment, even for symptoms it might have caused. That's like drinking more wine to cure your hangover. Logical only if your entire medical worldview runs on ritual instead of science. And let's not forget the children of the court. If the king was bathing in honey, so were his sons and daughters. Royal children were given sweetened porridges, honeyed breads, and early exposure to temple feasts. Some juvenile mummies show the same signs of inflammation and fat deposits as adults. Not a great sign. It suggests that dietary excess started early, reinforced by both privilege and ritual. Nobody in that palace ever heard the phrase "maybe not a second helping." Now, imagine being in that banquet hall. The plates have been cleared, and dessert is rolled out on golden trays, pastries shaped like lotus blossoms, figs split and stuffed with crushed nuts and honey, wine chilled in ceramic coolers. The air smells like nectar. The pharaoh licks his fingers and leans back, bloated and pleased. Around him, servants light more incense. Musicians play soft notes on lyres. It's beautiful, it's serene, and it's quietly, irrevocably fatal. You shift your weight on the imaginary cushion and think about all that sweetness, how it defined a culture, how it crowned a king, and how underneath the honey's shimmer there was always a warning, one they couldn't hear or wouldn't. Because gods don't count spoonfuls, they just ask for more. Now imagine you're a guest at one of those lavish palace banquets. Not a god, not even a noble, just someone granted the extraordinary favour of sitting within spitting distance of the pharaoh's feast. You take in the glow of oil lamps, reflecting off bronze and gold, the heavy scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and freshly baked bread lingering like a fog. The table stretches endlessly, piled high with foods that gleam, steam, and practically beg to be devoured. But something's missing. You glance from platter to platter and slowly realise there are no vegetables. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration. There's a sad little bowl of leeks near the back and a pile of cucumbers that seem to be functioning more as decoration than cuisine. But in terms of proportion, greens don't stand a chance. For the royal elite, vegetables were filler food, plain, humble, and a bit too earthy to be divine. And if you're pharaoh, you don't eat anything humble. You eat status, you eat symbolism, you eat the most difficult, expensive, and labour-intensive foods available. That means meats, sweets, and rich breads, not cabbage. So while the peasants out in the fields lived on onions, lentils, and wild greens because they had to, the pharaoh actively avoided them because he could. Why nibble on a scallion when you could devour a spit-roasted duck, smothered in fig syrup? Why scoop up lentil mash when you could dunk your bread into a creamy liver pâté, served on a gilded dish? It was a diet of defiance against the natural food pyramid, and one entirely fueled by power. The irony, of course, is that those commoner diets, low in fat, high in plant fibre, minimal on sugars, were probably much healthier. Archaeologists examining non-elite skeletons from the Middle and New Kingdoms have found surprisingly low rates of obesity-related illness. Sure, they had their own problems, bone stress, anemia, and frequent malnutrition. But they weren't suffering from metabolic overload. Their arteries weren't fossilised. Their joints weren't swollen from gout. Their bodies told a story of hardship, yes, but not of indulgence gone wrong. Back in the palace, though, veggies were practically taboo at the highest level of dining. Part of it was cultural. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the meal of a king had to reflect divine perfection. Vegetables, with their messy roots and earthy associations, were seen as too close to the dust, too ordinary. Gods didn't dig for food, they received it in golden vessels. So did the pharaoh, and that meant vegetables rarely made it onto his plate in meaningful ways. Take garlic, for example. It was known, valued, even used medicinally. But in royal cuisine, it was a background flavour, not a main act. The same goes for lettuce, which the Egyptians actually associated with fertility thanks to its milky sap, but it still didn't command a place of honour at court banquets. It was more of a temple garden feature than a pharaoh's craving. The things we now classify as dietary superstars were, in that world, just footnotes. There's also an economic layer to this. Meat and bread came from large-scale agriculture and temple-controlled herds. They were symbols of abundance and centralised power. Vegetables, by contrast, came from personal gardens and community plots. They were small-scale, local, intimate. A bowl of lentils didn't prove the might of empire. A parade of cattle carcasses, roasted whole and wheeled into the throne room. Now that sent a message. Let's throw in a fringe-y bit of Egyptological debate here. Some researchers argue that the exclusion of vegetables from royal diets was partly a purity issue. Root vegetables, especially, were associated with the underworld. Buried in the earth, hidden from the sun, too close to decay. In a culture obsessed with light, rebirth and cleanliness, Eating things from the dark soil might have carried a subtle spiritual stigma. Others say that's overthinking it, that the pharaoh just liked meat and didn't feel the need to apologise for it. Honestly, it could be both. Even more bizarre, you find some tomb inscriptions and paintings showing the pharaoh offering vegetables to the gods. But that doesn't mean he ate them. In fact, it's likely he didn't. Offering wasn't the same as partaking. You could present a bowl of onions to Ra and then turn right around and enjoy a honey-drenched pigeon without touching the onions yourself. Kind of divine outsourcing of your fibre intake. Meanwhile, the medical consequences of this vegetable aversion were stacking up. Lack of plant fibre contributes to constipation, bloating, and slower digestion, especially in a diet so heavy with protein and refined carbs. Mummified intestines have sometimes shown signs of impacted stool, a charmingly gross but scientifically valuable glimpse into the ancient royal gut. Imagine being wrapped for eternity with 2 pounds of undigested duck fat and no spinach to speak of, not the afterlife you were promised. You also see signs of micronutrient deficiencies, vitamin C for instance. Scurvy wasn't a raging epidemic, but there's subtle evidence of inflamed gums and fragile blood vessels in some mummies, suggesting that even kings weren't immune to the slow damage of missing veggies. No citrus, no leafy greens, and no real variety meant the pharaoh was rich in calories and poor in nutrition. Of course, none of this was questioned at the time. If anything, avoiding vegetables reinforced the pharaoh's status. He didn't need survival food. He wasn't scraping by like a commoner. He didn't need your roots and stalks. He ate symbols. He ate luxury. And luxury, as it turns out, is incredibly bad for your colon. And so the pattern continued. Day after day, banquet after banquet, with barely a cucumber in sight. The king's meals were designed to show what he had, not what he needed. And if his body suffered, well, that was the price of eternity. Besides, a little bloating never showed up in the temple carvings. Now close your eyes and picture that table again. Gleaming meats, overflowing bread baskets, bowls of dried figs and jars of golden beer. It's all beautiful, and not a vegetable in sight, not even a garnish. Because in ancient Egypt, greens were for peasants. The gods had goose. The air changes as you move into the royal storerooms again. But this time you're not staring at barley sacks or honey jars. You're eyeing something far more exotic. Glazed amphorae labelled in foreign script, crates marked with the names of distant lands, and bundles of unfamiliar spices and fruits that never grew anywhere near the Nile. This isn't your basic grain hoard. This is the luxury aisle of the pharaoh's pantry. And with it came not just new flavours and aromas, but an entire catalogue of imported health problems. Because as Egypt's empire expanded, so did its appetite, not just for power, but for indulgence. From Lebanon came cedar oil and strong wines. From Punt, somewhere near modern-day Somalia, came incense, ivory, and sweet myrrh-soaked delicacies. From the eastern Mediterranean came figs, olives, and goat cheeses so rich they practically melted in your hand. The farther Egypt reached, the more opulent the pharaoh's diet became, and that meant an influx of foreign foodstuffs, many of which weren't exactly heart-healthy. One of the most prized imports, red wine, not the thick, unfiltered date beer of the locals, but grape wine aged in amphorae, infused with herbs and sweetness. It became a staple of royal court life, used in rituals, banquets, and everyday sipping. Some tombs contain not just jars of wine, but labels, vintage markings, vineyard names, even tasting notes, seriously. It's the world's oldest sommelier dream. But unlike beer, which was carb-heavy but relatively low in alcohol, this wine packed a punch. Add in sugar, and you had a beverage tailor-made to fuel inflammation, raise blood pressure, and load the pharaoh's liver with more stress than a chariot race gone sideways. Meats were another indulgence that bloomed with expansion. Foreign traders brought in new animals, including exotic birds and richer cuts of meat preserved in salt and spices. The pharaohs already had access to goose, duck, and beef, but now they were sampling antelope, imported fish dried in honey, and cheese fattened with sheep's milk. Foods denser, greasier, and more complex than the local fare. These weren't just new dishes, they were statements. To eat a bird from Nubia or figs from Byblos was to declare yourself master of many lands, but their pride came at a cost. And then there were the sweets. Dried fruits, apricots, raisins, pomegranates, arrived in decorative boxes, often reserved for desserts and ceremonies. Mixed with honey, wine, or goat cheese, they made for decadent treats. And while fruits sound innocent enough, in these quantities and combinations, they were nutritional time bombs. Fructose overload, anyone? The body, already dealing with a parade of heavy meats and refined breads, didn't exactly know what to do with a handful of sugar bombs dipped in honey glaze. This influx of rich foreign food introduced not just calories but unpredictability. The Egyptian digestive system, already strained from years of bread, beer and ceremonial indulgence, now had to process fats and proteins it wasn't evolved to handle. Chronic bloating, gas and inflammation became silent guests at the banquet. Again, no one talked about it. Certainly not to the king. Instead, physicians wrote spells for a swelling in the belly, or the heat of food trapped in the bowels. Sounds appetizing, right? A particularly grim example comes from Ramses III. His tomb goods included an astonishing array of imported foods, far more than necessary for any reasonable diet, even in the afterlife. Though his body was violently attacked, as revealed by CT scans showing a slashed throat. Yes, assassination. The sheer scale of food in his burial speaks volumes. Even in death, kings clung to the status symbols of indulgence. They were going to eat like gods in the next world, even if their stomachs had already given up in this one. And it wasn't just individual gluttony, it was institutional. The temples maintained networks of trade specifically to secure foreign delicacies. Temple records from Karnak and Luxor show consistent deliveries of Syrian wine, Nubian animal fats and incense used in both religious and culinary settings. This was a system built to maintain the illusion of eternal abundance, even when it meant importing disease by the barrel. There's also a debate among historians. Did these imported goods introduce new allergens or digestive conditions into the population? Some fringe theories suggest ancient food sensitivities, lactose intolerance, for example, may have quietly plagued the elite. The appearance of mysterious swellings, chronic fatigue, and heaviness of the limbs in some medical papyri might point toward undiagnosed food responses. While we can't DNA test a mummy's lactose tolerance yet, the suspicion lingers. Perhaps the pharaoh's bloated belly was less divine prosperity and more post-dairy disaster. Even more curious are the imports used for flavour alone. Things like cinnamon and pepper, brought from as far as India. These weren't daily staples, but they were used to spike dishes for elite palates. Imagine a fig-stuffed pigeon seasoned with myrrh and cinnamon, aromatic, decadent, and probably swimming in salt. The pharaoh's meals became both more delicious and more dangerous as trade routes expanded. Luxury, it turns out, has a way of sneaking past the taste buds and settling into the arteries. And yet, the association with divinity remained. Eating foreign delicacies was a symbol of global mastery. The king didn't just rule Egypt, he consumed the world. His diet was a map of conquest. A Nubian duck on the plate, that wasn't dinner, it was an edible monument to dominance. So while the commoners chewed their onions and boiled barley, the pharaoh sat among spices, oils, and imported fat. His food, like his empire, stretched far beyond the Nile, and so did his waistline. These delicacies were never meant for balance or health. They were designed to impress, to overwhelm, to prove that the sun itself bowed to the appetite of the king. You sit with that now. The heavy, fragrant air of the banquet room thick with steam from unfamiliar sources. You hear languages in the kitchens that weren't spoken here a generation ago. And on the plate before the king, a piece of something that once flew across a desert, seasoned in a way no Egyptian farmer would recognize. He eats it slowly, reverently, and somewhere inside his body braces for another gentle, imperial disaster. Let's stay at the royal table a little longer, just enough to raise a cup and toast the pharaoh. Not with water, of course, that's for peasants and livestock. You're drinking wine. Deep red, syrupy and warm. It's been sitting in a clay amphora since the sun came up, slowly absorbing the scent of the cellar. Earth, wood smoke, fermented fruit. You lift the cup to your lips. It's thick, it coats your tongue. It's sweet. Too sweet. And as the musicians pluck out soft notes on their harps and dancers sway to hypnotic rhythms, the king drains another cup. Then another. And another. Because wine in ancient Egypt wasn't just a beverage. It was a lifestyle. A status marker, a ritual object, and for the pharaoh it was a kind of liquid crown. Wine meant luxury, it meant control over agriculture, trade, religion, even time itself. Wine was only for the elite. Ordinary Egyptians, if they drank at all, drank beer, but beer was local, practical and abundant. Wine, that was for gods. And gods, as we've already established, were not exactly known for moderation. Let's be clear, Egyptian wine wasn't like the modern dry Merlot you might sip with dinner. It was sticky, dense, and loaded with sugar. Sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes thickened with honey, and often left to ferment well past what your liver would consider polite. This was not a casual drink, this was a feast for the bloodstream, and the royal bloodstream soaked in it. Wine was consumed in religious rituals, in court celebrations, and, according to tomb inscriptions, even in quiet daily meals. "Bring forth the wine jar," says one painted servant on a tomb wall. The king reclines, hand extended, ready to drink in another drop of cosmic pleasure. It's a scene repeated across the centuries. Over time, wine shifted from a sacred offering to a habitual indulgence, and that's where the trouble began. You see, the effects of wine weren't just spiritual, they were very, very physical. Chronic wine consumption leads to a laundry list of health issues. Liver damage, cognitive decline, bloating, hypertension, and, you guessed it, weight gain. Combined with a sugar-heavy diet and a sedentary lifestyle, wine functioned less like a celebratory toast and more like a slow, sticky toxin. Some mummies show the signs. Evidence of fatty liver, enlarged organs, facial puffiness, even possible signs of early dementia. Yes, you read that right. There's a theory still debated that long-term alcohol use among some elite Egyptians led to cognitive decline. Scholars point to certain erratic policies, sudden religious shifts and documented mood swings in some rulers as potential symptoms. Akhenaten, for instance, the heretic king who tried to rewire Egyptian religion overnight, has been scrutinized for signs of neurological degeneration. While his eccentricity is more likely political than medical, the idea lingers. Maybe too many cups at court could cloud even a god's judgment. And yet wine remained untouchable. No one dared question it. If you walked into the palace and said, "Hey, maybe try some water with dinner?" you'd be hurled into the crocodile pit faster than you could spell Osiris. The king drank wine because the gods drank wine. Or rather, the gods had wine poured for them, which the king, surprise, got to consume afterward. As we've already seen, divine offerings had a way of ending up in royal stomachs. Here's a quirky fact for you. Some wine amphorae were inscribed with vintage details, literally. Wine of year 4 from the Western Hills, made by the chief vintner Didu. That's how much pride was taken in the stuff. It wasn't just alcohol, it was an industry. Pharaohs had their own vineyards, often within temple estates. The wine produced there was considered holy, and since you wouldn't dare waste holy wine, you had to drink it, a lot of it. In tombs, jars of wine were placed near the body for use in the afterlife. Some jars even contained notes like, "Wine for the first day of the year," or "Wine for the feast of drunkenness." That's right, the feast of drunkenness was a real thing. Celebrated in honour of Hathor, goddess of joy, music and intoxication, it encouraged worshippers to drink until they collapsed, literally, believing that in their stupor they became closer to the divine. That same logic permeated the royal court. Drunkenness wasn't weakness, it was transcendence. But the body disagreed. CT scans of elite mummies showed signs of chronic dehydration, kidney stress, and vascular damage consistent with long-term alcohol intake. Combine that with a rich, salty diet, and you've got a recipe for disaster. The pharaoh's body may have looked majestic in art, but internally, his organs were under siege. There's some speculation, again not confirmable but tantalizing, that wine use also affected fertility. Some royal lines show alarming levels of inbreeding and reproductive difficulty. While that's usually chalked up to politics and dynastic purity, read marrying your sister, alcohol-related hormonal imbalances could have contributed. Ancient texts mention kings begging the gods for sons, even after multiple marriages. And if your body is drowning in sugar, booze, and ceremonial laziness, well, fertility's not going to be your strong suit. Still, no one put the goblet down. Wine was too deeply woven into the image of kingship. It was served in golden cups, poured by trained servants, offered to gods and consumed by kings who believed it kept them divine. One inscription even claims a particular wine gladdens the heart of Pharaoh and brings light to his days. It might have also brought hypertension and the world's earliest wine belly, but nobody was documenting that. The deeper irony. Wine was once a symbol of sophistication and order, tied to agriculture, refinement and civilization itself. But in the palace it became a liquid mask. It dulled pain, disguised fatigue, and filled the empty hours between ceremonies. The more wine the pharaoh drank, the less real his world became. The goblet never emptied, but neither did the ache beneath it. So you sit back now, listening to the laughter echo down the halls, the sound of wine sloshing in amphorae, the clink of gold-rimmed cups. It's festive, it's grand, but it's also a warning. Somewhere in the corner, a servant refills the king's cup again. He nods, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifts it to his lips. He drinks, and the empire drifts one sip closer to decline. The palace is glowing tonight. Torches flicker against polished limestone walls, casting warm shadows on columns carved with gods and lotus blooms. The air hums with anticipation. Musicians are tuning lyres, scribes are sharpening reed pens, slaves polish the gold leaf rims of drinking cups until they sparkle like tiny suns. Something big is about to happen, and you're lucky, or cursed enough to witness it. A royal banquet, not just a dinner, but a state event. A ritual, a performance, a slow-motion health crisis wearing a garland of flowers. This is the feast. A ceremonial celebration held to impress, to appease, to honour, and, let's be real, to stuff the royal belly like a goose headed for the afterlife. These weren't casual affairs, they were massive multi-course spectacles with implications far beyond the digestive system. A banquet wasn't just food, it was diplomacy, theology, politics, and PR all rolled into one bloated night. Let's break it down. First, the guest list. You don't just invite your best friends. You invite rival nobles, foreign dignitaries, high priests, military officials, and sometimes even personifications of deities, actors in elaborate costumes performing as Hathor or Horus to bless the proceedings. Everyone's watching, everyone's calculating, and at the centre of it all is the pharaoh, lounging on a platform, surrounded by fans, perfume and servants who never stop moving. He barely speaks, he doesn't need to. His power is expressed through food, what he eats, how much, and how easily it is served to him. The menu, excessive by any standard. We're talking tables piled with roasted fowl glazed beef ribs, sugared pastries shaped like crocodiles, pyramids of dates, dried fruits soaked in wine, lotus-scented beer, honey-baked breads, and skewers of goat fat rolled in herbs. There's no subtlety here. Every dish is a flex. Every aroma announces, we are rich, favoured by the gods, and completely unconcerned with the concept of portion control. Servants parade the dishes in choreographed order, laying them out before the pharaoh like offerings at a temple. The food isn't just for him, but he always gets the first bite. And when he takes it, slowly deliberate, the entire room exhales in approval. This is the king's moment. And yet, behind the pageantry, something unsettling lingers. His robes are tighter than last year. He's leaning heavier on his elbow. His eyes are more sunken. But no one says a word, they clap, they toast, they call him radiant. This pattern wasn't rare, it was institutionalised. Festivals like the Sed, held after 30 years of rule and then every 3, were essentially multi-day food orgies masked as religious renewal. The king was supposed to prove his vitality by performing physical feats, running laps, lifting symbols of strength, but by the New Kingdom, these acts were often ceremonial, or even faked. What couldn't be faked, however, was the feast. That part had to be real, lavish, endless. The bigger the banquet, the stronger the king, at least on paper. But you know what happens when you eat until you're more stuffed than the animals on the serving platter? The body rebels, bloating, heartburn, maybe a little dizziness, and in the long term, weight gain, organ stress, systemic inflammation. It's the royal version of death by charcuterie board. And the pharaohs did this dozens, even hundreds of times over their lifetimes. One mummy, likely from the 20th dynasty, showed signs of chronic indigestion. His stomach lining was thickened, inflamed, and partially ruptured. Historians suspect he may have suffered a gastric ulcer, possibly from years of overeating rich, spicy or fermented foods. Imagine trying to play God while wincing through every swallow. But cancelling a banquet wasn't an option. That would have been political suicide, so he kept showing up, kept eating, and kept unravelling inside. Now here's a quirky twist. Some of the feasts weren't even for the living. Mortuary feasts were held in honour of dead ancestors or gods, but the food prepared for these events often ended up on the tables of the living. In other words, the king ate what he offered to the dead. A bit creepy? Maybe. But in ancient Egypt it was perfectly normal. The line between divine and digestive was always blurry. There's a fringe theory among Egyptologists that these banquets doubled as subtle forms of political manipulation. Feed your enemies well enough and they forget their grievances. Invite your rivals, overserve them wine, and suddenly their ambitions dissolve in a cloud of meat sweats and hangovers. Meanwhile, the king sits in the centre, seemingly immortal, untouched by excess. He is the eye of the storm, a storm made entirely of goose fat and date syrup. Of course, the king wasn't untouched. He was just better at hiding the damage, until he couldn't. Some late-period pharaohs are depicted with puffier faces, rounder limbs, and heavier frames in their statues, not because the sculptors were bad at flattery, but because reality was seeping into art. In time, even the masks couldn't smooth it all out. And still, the banquets went on, because the feast wasn't about the food, it was about the illusion, the show, the idea that Egypt was eternal, abundant, and perfectly ordered under the king's divine rule. You didn't cancel the feast just because the king had indigestion. You changed the pace, pushed in another cushion, brought out stronger wine. So here you sit now, a ghost among the flickering shadows of another ancient banquet. The air is thick with spices. The harpist plucks a slow looping tune, and the king takes another bite. His 6th serving of spiced duck tonight. No one looks away, no one flinches, because to show concern would be to break the spell, to acknowledge the obvious, that the feast is not a celebration anymore.
It's a ritual of decline?
The flickering torches don't stop at the banquet hall doors. They wind deeper into the palace, through perfumed corridors lined with hieroglyphs, past carved lions and gold-tipped columns, until they reach the women's quarters, where the other half of this story waits in silken silence. Because if you thought the pharaoh's diet was excessive, wait until you meet the queens, princesses, and ladies of the court. Their lives were just as luxurious, just as ritualized, and just as heavy, literally. And for them, obesity wasn't just a side effect, it was status. Let's get one thing straight. Ancient Egyptian women weren't confined to the background. Royal women especially held immense political and spiritual sway. Queens like Hatshepsut ruled in their own right, and others, like Nefertari and Ta, were power players behind the scenes. But with power came ritual, and with ritual came food. Endless food. Women of the court were expected to dine like goddesses, and goddesses, as it turns out, weren't into portion control either. In fact, artistic depictions of elite women shift noticeably across dynasties. Early tomb paintings show them lithe and graceful, adorned with diaphanous linen and lotus garlands. But by the time you hit the later periods, some statues and paintings hint at a different reality. Rounder cheeks, fuller bodies, thicker arms. Not overt caricatures, but soft, deliberate hints that these women lived in abundance. In some rare cases, mummies of royal women reveal even more. Fat layers preserved around the abdomen, calcified arteries, and signs of high blood pressure. The same metabolic wreckage as the men, just hidden beneath linen and decorum. Take the case of Queen Hatshepsut. Yes, we've mentioned her before, but it's worth revisiting. Ruling as pharaoh for over 2 decades, she had all the trappings of kingship, the beard, the titles, the divine status, and, by the looks of her remains, the same royal health issues. Scans suggest she was obese, suffered from diabetes, and possibly had cancer. She limped, she wheezed, and she used a potent, possibly carcinogenic skin lotion daily. This wasn't a woman sipping on cucumber water and doing Pilates in the courtyard. She lived the full pharaonic lifestyle, banquets, wine, rich foods, and everything that came with them. And she wasn't alone. Royal women participated in the same festivals, received the same divine offerings, and had access to the same palace kitchens, overflowing with sweet cakes, spiced meats, and vats of beer. There are inscriptions detailing the kinds of foods prepared specifically for queens. Honey-sweet pastries, lotus root stews, milk-soaked bread puddings flavoured with saffron. These weren't snacks. They were edible declarations of power, fertility, and divine favour. Now here's the cultural twist. In ancient Egypt, a fuller female figure wasn't always seen as unhealthy. Quite the opposite. It was often associated with fertility, prosperity, and beauty. Goddesses like Hathor and Isis were occasionally depicted as curvaceous maternal figures. So when a queen gained weight, it could actually elevate her status. proof that she was well fed, well protected, and clearly favoured by the gods. Skinny women didn't rule kingdoms, plump, fragrant, wine-sipping, silk-wrapped ones did. And then there's the role of pregnancy. Royal women were expected to produce heirs, and pregnancy was celebrated with ritual food offerings. After childbirth, these women were often pampered with restorative banquets, milk baths, and heavy, nourishing foods meant to replenish the divine womb. But there wasn't a postpartum workout regimen waiting around the corner. There was just another feast. Another round of honey-slicked pastries and jugs of sweet wine delivered by bowing servants. Some fringe scholars suggest this constant indulgence created a quiet epidemic of obesity-related complications among royal women, fertility issues, preeclampsia, even early mortality. It's difficult to confirm, of course. Many female mummies were poorly preserved, misidentified, or simply lost to time, but where remains exist, the pattern is familiar. Excessive fat buildup, signs of cardiovascular strain, and minimal muscle mass. These weren't women who climbed pyramids or rode into battle. They lounged, posed, dined, and ruled form-shaded balconies. Even the cosmetic rituals of court life added to the health toll. Ointments and perfumes used by elite women were often laced with lead, mercury, and other toxins. Combined with diets high in sugar and fat, their bodies became ticking time bombs of inflammation and cellular stress. One analysis of a royal ointment found it to be chemically similar to engine grease, and yet it was applied daily to the face, eyes, and chest. Beauty, like royalty, was not gentle. Let's also talk about the daughters. Princesses from a very young age were inducted into this world of ritual consumption. Ceremonial meals, honey-drenched cakes, and sips of sweet beer were part of their religious training. Some girl children were betrothed as early as age 10 and groomed with the same indulgent food rituals as their mothers. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these young royals were already showing signs of weight-related strain by adolescence. Fat deposits, shallow rib cages, early joint damage. Childhood obesity isn't just a modern problem. The royal palace had its own version, wrapped in silk and covered in lotus oil. There's a scholarly debate here too. Some argue that the art exaggerated ideal beauty, while the bodies beneath the wrappings tell a grimmer tale. Others suggest that body shape was always symbolic, that the actual condition of these women didn't matter as much as the image they projected. Either way, the facts remain. Elite women lived in a world of ceremonial indulgence, constant pampering, and zero accountability. And unlike the pharaohs, they didn't have even the illusion of action. They didn't march in parades or wield crooks and flails. Their movements were even more restricted, by etiquette, by fashion, by confinement to the palace. They were ornamental, yes, but also instrumental in upholding the illusion of abundance. Their appearances, round faces, heavy necks, soft hands, were signs that the kingdom was strong. If the queen looked full, Egypt was full. Now picture one of them, perhaps a queen, perhaps a favourite concubine, resting on a stone bench near a reflecting pool. Her attendants are fanning her with palm fronds while another rubs scented oil into her feet. She lifts a fig to her lips, chews slowly, then sips from a cup of pomegranate wine. She's beautiful, regal, and visibly exhausted. Her ankles are swollen, her stomach aches, her head feels fuzzy, and her vision blurs in the afternoon light. But she smiles, because to frown would ruin the spell. And somewhere in the cool of a chamber down the hall, another tray of sweet cakes is being prepared. Let's tiptoe into the nursery now, not the soft pastel kind you're used to, but a marble-floored chamber wrapped in linen curtains, where everything smells faintly of myrrh, milk, and polished stone. This is where Egypt's future gods are being raised, the sons and daughters of pharaohs, small, wide-eyed, and swaddled in silk. You'd think, maybe, that youth would shield them from the gluttony that infects the palace halls, that their young bodies would be allowed to run, to breathe, to grow into lean heirs fit to wear the double crown. But no, the same sacred script that fed their fathers until they wheezed also applies to them, just on a smaller, sweeter plate. Royal childhood in ancient Egypt was not a time of discipline or moderation. It was an endless introduction to ritual indulgence. From the moment these children could sit up straight, they were served sweetened porridges, warm milk mixed with honey, date syrup drizzled over barley mash, and soft little loaves of bread soaked in goat cream. Sounds adorable, right? Like a divine breakfast cereal commercial. But look a little closer, and you'll see a pattern of overfeeding dressed up as celebration. Every spoonful wasn't just nutrition, it was an offering. Every bite was a rite of passage, and no one ever said, maybe that's enough for today. You'd think at least the youngest pharaohs, those who took the throne as toddlers or tweens, might have avoided the long-term damage. But history tells another story. Several child kings and young princes left behind mummies that show early signs of metabolic strain. Tutankhamun is the most famous, of course. He was around 18 or 19 when he died, but his body reads like someone much older. Clubfoot, bone necrosis, swollen joints, decayed teeth. His diet was royal, sure, but it was killing him before his political enemies could even get a dagger in. His tomb, filled with exquisite food offerings, paints a picture of a boy who never knew a day without luxury. Jars of wine labelled for future ceremonies, baskets of fruit, dried meats wrapped in linen. But the CT scans show a body already breaking down. He may have had congenital health issues, likely the result of inbreeding, but poor diet surely didn't help. If you're hobbling through life with a deformed foot, the last thing you need is a menu that clogs your arteries and rots your teeth before you're old enough to grow a full beard. Other young royals didn't fare much better. Some child mummies, buried with doll-like trinkets and tiny thrones, reveal an unsettling reality. Bloated bellies, fat layers beneath the skin, tooth decay before adulthood. These weren't kids running around palace gardens barefoot and sun-kissed. These were pampered, padded, and presented as miniature deities, heavily fed, rarely exercised, and constantly monitored by attendants who never said no. In elite families, indulgence wasn't just allowed, it was expected. To restrict a royal child's food intake might be seen as cruelty, or even blasphemy. After all, the pharaoh was divine, and his children were fragments of that same holiness. If the gods wanted them lean, surely they'd stay lean. But if they plumped up like sacrificial calves, that must be divine will too. Past the honey cakes. Now here's the quirky bit. Egyptian toys and figurines often depicted children in exaggerated forms. Plump cheeks, round bellies, thick limbs. At first glance they seem stylized, just part of the artistic tradition. But paired with what we know from mummy scans, they start to look uncomfortably realistic. Were these representations of ideal childhood? Or quiet, unspoken truths about what royal children actually looked like? Soft, slow, and weighted down with too much privilege, too soon? There's also the matter of ritual feeding. During religious festivals, child royals were often presented to the public alongside the pharaoh, dressed in ceremonial garb and fed choice morsels as a demonstration of divine prosperity. It wasn't about nourishing them, it was about showcasing abundance. The crowd didn't cheer because the prince looked healthy. They cheered because he looked rich. The thicker the child, the stronger the illusion of national strength. And yes, the girls were included too. Princesses were often raised alongside their brothers, receiving the same ceremonial meals, the same honeyed drinks, and the same pampering. By adolescence, many were married off, sometimes to much older royals, sometimes to their own relatives, and expected to produce heirs of their own. And the cycle began again, only this time with more sugar. One fringe theory suggests that the earliest signs of inherited metabolic disease in Egypt can be seen not just in royal adults, but in these children. Some medical papyri describe young ones with swollen limbs, heat in the belly, and sweet breath. Scholars debate whether this is poetic language or clinical observation, but the implication is there. Illness didn't wait for old age in the house of Pharaoh. It started in the cradle. You start to see how tragic it really is. These weren't just spoiled kids, they were trapped. Their lives were pre-scripted. Grow fat, sit still, smile during festivals, and inherit the golden throne. The palace was their playground, but also their prison. With every banquet, with every syrup-drenched cake handed to them by well-meaning attendants, their bodies lost a little more freedom. And imagine being a parent in that system. If you were the queen, and your child was growing heavier, more tired, less lively, what could you do? Say, no more dates for my son? Risk offending the priests? Call into question the divine abundance of the throne? Impossible. Better to pretend everything was fine. Better to tuck them into bed after another feast. Whisper a prayer to Hathor, and hope that the gods preferred chubby little kings. So here you sit, on a plush stool in the edge of a royal nursery, listening to the soft snores of a future pharaoh. His breath is uneven. His belly rises and falls beneath silk sheets. Nearby, a servant lays out tomorrow's breakfast. Sweet beer, figs and spiced barley bread. He's 8 years old, he's already full, and he hasn't even started ruling yet. You're wandering through a gallery now, one with walls of stone instead of canvas, and a hush that hums louder than silence. Torchlight dances over the surfaces, illuminating image after image of divine stillness. Pharaohs striding confidently, heads high, torsos slim, arms toned. Every movement captured in a stylized eternity. These are the images that have shaped how we think of ancient Egyptian rulers. Idealized, ageless, invincible. But you've been backstage now. You've peeked beneath the linen, and suddenly these perfect carvings start to look suspicious. Because if the kings were obese, bloated by feasts and slowed by wine and honey, why don't the walls show it? Welcome to the art of omission. Ancient Egyptian art was famously rigid, literally and figuratively. Bodies faced sideways, legs in a half stride, chins lifted like they knew the future and didn't care for it. This wasn't realism, it was symbolism. The style wasn't meant to reflect the body as it was, but as it should be. The result? Pharaohs were carved not as humans, but as ideals. And yet, if you look closely, really closely, there are cracks in the illusion. Take Akhenaten, for example, the heretic king who abandoned traditional gods for a sun disk and shook Egyptian religion to its foundations. His statues are weird. He's shown with a narrow face, protruding belly, spindly limbs and wide hips. Art historians argued for centuries over what this meant. Was it symbolic? Gender-blurring theological statement? Or did Akhenaten actually look like that? Physically soft, bloated, maybe sick? Some have suggested he suffered from a genetic disorder. Others think the strange body shape is simply the first time a pharaoh's physical reality crept into public art. But then there's the counterpoint. The vast majority of pharaohs look nearly identical in their depictions. No matter their age, health or era, they're portrayed as eternally youthful and fit. Ramses II, who ruled for over 6 decades and likely died at nearly 90 with severe arthritis and a hunched frame, is shown forever strong. His statues tower with perfect symmetry and muscular poise. Never mind that his actual skeleton shows spinal curvature, dental decay, and a body ravaged by time and diet. The art had a job to do, and it wasn't honesty. This disconnect between image and body isn't unique to Egypt, but the level of consistency is almost comical. Some pharaohs had enormous statues commissioned late in life, after decades of decline, yet every chisel stroke insisted they were ageless titans. The message? The king may change, age, bloat, but the institution, the divine image of kingship, does not. In that way, Egyptian art was less a mirror and more a spell, a declaration of what reality ought to be, not what it was. And yet, sometimes truth slips through. In a few tombs, you'll find lower-ranking officials depicted with more honest proportions, rounder faces, heavier bodies, even slouched postures. These men weren't gods, they could be human, and sometimes even royal depictions couldn't hide everything. A wall relief of a late state period pharaoh shows him seated in a temple, and while his face is idealized, his body has a softness that suggests the artist knew what they were smoothing over. It's subtle, a fuller chest, thicker arms, but it's there. There's also the curious case of the so-called funerary masks. These golden visages, made to preserve the king's face for eternity, follow a particular template, symmetrical, serene, unlined. Tutankhamun's mask is the most famous, flawless, angular, a portrait of divine youth. But the mummy underneath, crooked teeth, misshapen skull, a fractured leg, the disconnect is jarring. It's like brushing a corpse and calling it history. Some fringe scholars have tried to argue that Egyptian art was never meant to deceive, it was just playing by its own rules. That's fair to a point, but when you pair the art with the medical scans of actual mummies, it's hard not to feel like the entire civilization was holding its breath. The king could be falling apart, collapsing from the weight of his own luxury, but as long as the statue stood tall, the illusion held. This matters because those images weren't just art, they were propaganda. They were the state's Instagram feed, curated and filtered to perfection. And just like modern social media, they created a toxic feedback loop. The pharaoh saw himself depicted as strong, divine, ageless. So did his court, so did the people. And so, despite the aches, the breathlessness, the silent organ failure, he had to keep up the performance. Because what happens when a god starts to look human? In a society so bound to ritual and continuity, visual honesty was dangerous. If a king allowed himself to be depicted as old, tired, or overweight, it might call the whole divine system into question. And when your power depends on cosmic order, the last thing you want is someone asking, hey, why does Ra's Chosen One have gout? You might think the artists could sneak in a little truth, but their hands were tied, literally. Artistic conventions were strictly enforced, passed down generation after generation with little room for deviation, so instead they bent reality just enough to please the eye and preserve the story. The result? A national archive of beautiful lies. But here's the strangest part. The Egyptians weren't entirely blind to this contradiction. Some wisdom texts speak of the dangers of excess, the frailty of the flesh, the value of moderation. There were even teachings that warned rulers not to become too indulgent, lest they lose their strength and wisdom. Did the kings read these scrolls? Probably. Did they take them to heart while nibbling on their fourth honey loaf of the morning? Not likely. So now, you stand in front of a massive statue, staring up at a god-king who looks like he could lift a bull and jog a marathon. But you know the truth. Inside this stone ideal is a man who groaned when he stood, who needed help stepping into his robes, who burped after every meal, a man who ruled the most powerful kingdom on earth, but couldn't conquer his appetite. And still, the chisel smoothed the lines, the paint firmed the flesh, and Egypt marched on, immortal in stone, even as its kings dissolved behind the scenes. You're in the embalming chamber now, cool, dark and thick, with the scent of resin, cedar oil, and something a little sour lingering beneath the perfume. The linen-wrapped body of the king lies on a tilted stone slab, arms across his chest, the last of the breath long gone from his sacred lungs. This is the final act of the pharaoh's life, the divine makeover before he's handed off to eternity. But as you watch the embalmer's work, the reality of royal death starts to peel away from the myth like linen from a decaying shoulder. Because beneath the golden mask, behind the layers of gauze and gods, the king's body is a mess. This is where the magic of mummification meets the awkward truth of biology. You'd think a divine ruler would ascend effortlessly, glowing and perfect into the afterlife. But first, he has to be cleaned up, desperately, meticulously. His body, once cloaked in silk and flattery, now reveals everything it was hiding. Fat deposits under the skin, distended abdomen, joints inflamed and stiff, sometimes the skin is mottled with sores or discoloured from organ failure. The embalmers don't flinch, they've seen worse. The afterlife doesn't accept sagging, swollen gods, so they get to work. First come the internal organs. They were removed quickly, often with surprising indifference. By the new kingdom, the standard practice was to pull the brain out through the nose using a long hooked instrument. Less surgery, more fishing trip. Then the liver, stomach, intestines and lungs, which were placed into canopic jars guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. But the heart? That's where it gets interesting. The heart, considered the seat of the soul and the organ weighed against the feather of truth in the afterlife, should be preserved with care. Except, sometimes it's missing. Gone entirely, lost in the chaos of a body too damaged to cooperate. One pharaoh, possibly Ramses V, was found with no heart in his chest cavity. The embalmers, it seems, removed it and never put it back. Scholars still argue why. Was it an accident? Was the organ too diseased to preserve? Or had the embalming priest simply decided that the gods didn't need to see what that heart looked like? If you've lived a life of excess, gluttony and inflammation, maybe facing a divine judgment scale isn't in your best interest. Next comes the cosmetic stage, literally a royal touch-up. The skin's coated in natron salts to dry out the tissue. Then resins are poured into the body cavity to prevent rot. But this also causes warping. Tissues shrink, bones shift. A distended stomach becomes sunken. Arms collapse inward. So the embalmers get creative. They stuff the body with linen and sawdust. In some cases, they carve out pockets under the skin to insert aromatic herbs, wads of resin-soaked fabric, even bits of padding to fill out deflated limbs. They're not just preserving a corpse, they're rebuilding an illusion. And here's where it gets surreal. Some royal mummies were so altered that by the end they bore only a vague resemblance to the person that they once were. Faces flattened, bellies reconstructed, fingers wrapped individually to maintain elegance. In one case, a toe was replaced with a stick wrapped in gauze. Another mummy was found with rolled linen stuffed into his cheeks to give him that youthful fullness he hadn't had in years. The ancient Egyptian version of post-mortem Botox. But even with all the manipulation, the signs remain. CT scans show arterial blockages, brittle bones, calcified kidneys. The embalmers couldn't fix those, they could only hide them. And that, more than anything, reveals the tension at the heart of pharaonic culture. The desire to immortalise a body that was never built for eternity. The more indulgent the life, the more desperate the cleanup. There's a fringe theory that some embalmers intentionally beautified the king's remains not just for religious reasons, but political ones. The smoother the corpse, the stronger the regime. A well-preserved body was a sign of a just reign. So if your pharaoh died bloated and ill, you pulled out the padding and resin until he looked like a marble sculpture. And if you had to fudge a few details, no one was checking. The mask would cover it anyway. Ah, yes, the mask. The ultimate cover-up. Think of Tutankhamun's golden face, its serene gaze frozen in perfection. It's flawless, untouched, the very picture of youth and serenity, but underneath, a broken leg, a twisted spine and signs of severe malaria or other illness. The mask was not a portrait, it was a denial, a statement to the gods that what lay beneath was divine, no matter the truth. A pharaoh could rot from the inside out, but as long as his face gleamed, the kingdom was safe. And here's where it all folds in on itself. The entire mummification process, elaborate, spiritual, and deeply theatrical, was about transformation. Taking a body ravaged by excess and restoring it to symbolic perfection. But it also reveals a subtle, unspoken understanding that the system had consequences. Why else go to such absurd lengths to disguise the damage? Why else stuff herbs into a chest cavity like potpourri into a cracked vase? One embalming manual found in a worker's tomb includes a note. Smooth the belly so it does not show the life he lived. That's chilling and telling. They weren't just preserving the king, they were erasing his habits. The feasts, the wine, the sedentary days on the throne, all removed, flattened, sanitized. So now you stand in the embalming chamber, watching as the final linen is wrapped, the final resin poured. The pharaoh's body no longer looks human. It looks perfect, but you know better. You know that beneath the wrappings lies a life of indulgence, sealed in honey and denial. The mask will shine, the tomb will dazzle, but inside the truth remains. The king died a god, but he was buried as a lesson. You're walking down a different kind of corridor now, one that feels out of step with the Egypt you've come to know. Gone are the strict hieroglyphs and idealized stone figures. The columns are still tall, still painted with lotus petals and solar discs, but the faces looking back at you are softer, rounder, and, wait a second, is that a Greek nose? Welcome to the Ptolemaic period, when the last Egyptian dynasties were ruled not by native kings, but by the descendants of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies, as they're known, brought with them a fresh wave of art, culture, political chaos, and, surprise surprise, culinary indulgence that managed to outdo even the most decadent of the old pharaohs. If the earlier pharaohs had a problem with moderation, the Ptolemies turned it into a full-time career. These weren't warrior kings. They were palace dwellers, steeped in Hellenistic luxury, educated in philosophy, and fed like prize livestock. Their diet was a bizarre fusion of Egyptian tradition and Greek decadence. Think roast goose seasoned with imported herbs, followed by a dessert of honeyed almond cakes and a goblet of spiced wine thick enough to chew. These rulers didn't just inherit the Egyptian appetite for rich food, they enhanced it with imported cheeses, richer meats, and a growing obsession with olive oil, which flowed almost as freely as the Nile itself. One of the most infamous Ptolemies, Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Phoiskon, literally the fat, was the human embodiment of this collision of wealth and overindulgence. Described by ancient historians as grotesquely overweight, lazy and cruel, he was reportedly so swollen with fat that he couldn't walk unassisted. Statues of him mysteriously omit his real shape, of course, but written records don't hold back. Ancient Greek scribes, with a flair for drama and shade, called him monstrous, detailing his massive girth, endless feasting, and legendary appetite, not just for food, but for revenge and political chaos. Physcon wasn't an outlier. The Ptolemies as a whole leaned heavily into the comforts of royal living. They inherited the Egyptian belief that kingship was divine, but they added a new twist: the Greek love for philosophy, art, and most notably, symposia, or drinking parties. Imagine combining the ceremonial gluttony of an Egyptian feast with the intellectual posturing of a Greek wine-soaked salon. That's the Ptolemaic court. One minute you're nibbling on fig-stuffed quail while discussing Stoic ethics. The next, you're vomiting into a golden basin while slaves fan you with ostrich feathers. Classy. And it wasn't just the men. Ptolemaic queens, most famously Cleopatra VII, inherited the same culture of indulgence. While Cleopatra herself is often romanticised as a brilliant, magnetic ruler, and she also lived in a palace where decadence was routine. Banquets were theatrical affairs. Every dish was designed to impress. One famous story, possibly apocryphal but deliciously on brand, claims Cleopatra once dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it to show off her wealth. Even if it's a myth, it reflects the culture. Display mattered more than digestion. The Ptolemies also ramped up the symbolic significance of food in politics. Offering foreign delicacies to guests wasn't just hospitality, it was diplomacy. Sharing a fattened goose or rare spice cake with a visiting ambassador wasn't just a courtesy. It was a way of saying, look what I can afford, look what you owe me. Meanwhile in Alexandria, the capital, food markets exploded with diversity. Imported delicacies from across the Mediterranean poured in. Salted fish from Spain, exotic spices from India, fine wines from Crete. The city's elite dined like emperors, while its poor scraped together leftover barley and breadcrumbs, just as they had for centuries. This culinary fusion created a kind of cultural cholesterol. Egyptian traditions emphasized the symbolic power of food, abundance as divine order, ritual offerings, eternal feasts. The Greeks brought intellectualism and leisure gluttony to the table. Together they birthed a class of rulers who ate excessively not just out of belief, but out of boredom, politics, and style. Of course, the consequences were the same, if not worse. By this time, the medical knowledge of both Egypt and Greece had advanced, at least a little. Physicians under the Ptolemies wrote about digestion, inflammation, even something resembling dietary advice, but it was rarely applied to the elite. You might be able to diagnose the king's gout, but good luck getting him to stop eating syrup-drenched duck 3 times a day. The illusion of divine rule was too powerful, the food too symbolic, the inertia too heavy. Some Ptolemaic mummies, yes, they still practice mummification, bear the same hallmarks as their predecessors. Fat deposits, calcified arteries, overworked organs. But there's something else too. A certain haste in the wrapping. A certain messiness in the tomb construction. It's as if the effort to maintain perfection was weakening. The golden mask was still placed over the face, but behind it the seams were showing. By this point Rome was watching Egypt closely. The Ptolemies, weakened by internal strife, poor health, and endless banquets, were easy prey. When Cleopatra famously aligned with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, she was trying to hold the last threads of her dynasty together. And though history loves to frame her downfall as a tragic romance, part of the truth is this: her kingdom was already bloated, stretched, slowing under the weight of centuries of excess. And so the Ptolemaic pharaohs became the final act in Egypt's long dinner party. They ate like kings, they drank like gods, and they died like everyone else, stuffed, sick, and embalmed with care. The marble busts still sit in museums, brows untroubled, cheeks smooth, but if you had a CT scanner and a time machine, you'd find the same story again. The same swollen livers, the same inflamed joints, the same hollow silence beneath the crown. You stand now at the edge of Alexandria, the sea wind in your face, the sun low over the Mediterranean. Somewhere behind you the kitchens still hum, the olive oil still drips, the wine still pours, but the empire is wobbling, and the banquet's last course is already cooling on the table. Picture this now, the throne room quiet, the incense gone stale, the pharaoh alone on his high seat, belly gently rising beneath layers of embroidered linen. He's not young anymore, not that he ever really was in the ways that counted. His movements are slower, more deliberate. His breath comes in soft huffs after each step. He's not dying, not yet, but the body tells its own stories. And here's the odd thing, he's not ashamed. If anything, he's proud, because in ancient Egypt, weight wasn't a flaw, it was a message. Obesity, in a strange twist of history, was sometimes seen as a symbol of divine favour and political power. A round body suggested abundance, stability, access. You didn't grow a soft belly working in the fields. You grew it being worshipped, fed and adored. The bigger the king, the richer the land, at least in theory. There's something so deeply ironic about that, right? In today's world, being too large is seen as a warning. In theirs, it was a billboard that screamed, "All is well." You can see this mindset show up in depictions of not just kings, but court officials and priests. Statues of nobles from the Middle and New Kingdoms occasionally show individuals with paunchy bellies and thick necks. These weren't caricatures, they were status flexes. If you were round, you were well fed. If you were well fed, you were important. End of story. The lean body wasn't admired, it was pitied. And it wasn't just about food. Fatness suggested you didn't have to labour, walk, or even move much. It meant you had people to do things for you. Bring your slippers, carry your fan, lift your goblet, turn the pages of your scroll. You were a being above physical hardship. That's a powerful image in a society built on hierarchies, where 95% of people lived on the edge of famine year after year. While peasants stooped over irrigation ditches, the king reclined on a cedar couch and reached for another slice of honeyed pigeon. It wasn't gluttony, it was theatre. There's a deeper, more spiritual layer too. In Egyptian thought, the body and soul were deeply intertwined. A prosperous physical form reflected a prosperous soul. Just as the Nile's flood brought fertility and abundance to the land, a king's fleshy form represented cosmic balance. He embodied the country. If he grew, the kingdom grew. If he shrank, it spelled trouble. The health of the land was measured in waistlines. But of course, not everyone bought into this. Among scholars today, there's a running debate. Did ancient Egyptians really value obesity? Or were they just resigned to it? Some argue that large bodies were tolerated, not celebrated. That the imagery of plumpness came with a wink, a silent, satirical nod to excess. Others insist the message was genuine. Food equals prosperity, and prosperity equals divine alignment. Honestly, it might have depended on the decade or the artist. Still, evidence points to deliberate cultivation of the image. Royal banquets weren't just about feeding, they were about being seen eating. Consuming in public was political. The king didn't just accept offerings, he devoured them. He participated in ritual meals where his fullness was symbolic. To leave a table unfinished would risk looking weak. You had to be visibly full, painfully full like the grain silos after a bountiful flood. That wasn't indigestion, that was ideology. And let's not forget the clothing. Robes were designed to flow and drape, emphasizing roundness while hiding movement. The visual effect was always the same, smooth, serene, massive. The body as monument, a living sphinx wrapped in linen and gold. Even accessories played a role. Wide belts, layered necklaces, and heavy collars that made the neck seem thicker, the chest broader. Nothing was accidental. The pharaoh wasn't just dressing up, he was curating a message with every crease and clasp. There's something almost tragic about this too, because it means the pharaoh couldn't be vulnerable, couldn't say, "I'm tired, I'm sick, I've had enough." He was trapped in a visual myth, one that required constant maintenance. The bigger he got, the more divine he seemed, but also the more fragile. Behind the ceremonial headdress and carefully shaped beard was a man who probably suffered from daily pain. But you'd never know it. You weren't supposed to. The performance didn't allow for frailty. And so over time the body became a political object, managed, expanded into protected, a slow accumulation of calories and symbolism. Even as the kingdom faltered, the royal belly stayed round. Even as rebellions brewed and treasuries emptied, the banquet table remained full. Because the image mattered more than the body itself, power had to look a certain way, solid, immovable and well-fed. Here's a strange detail that sums it up. Some tomb inscriptions include lists of meals consumed by the deceased during their life. Not just what they ate, but how much. These were brag sheets. He ate 12 oxen, 50 geese, 10,000 loaves of bread. Not metaphors, not symbolic, just raw numbers carved into stone like battle victories. Because for the elite, fullness was the ultimate resume. You're starting to see it now, the way food became a language. Not one of taste or nutrition, but of image and dominance. The more you ate, the more you were. And so the king grew, slowly, inevitably, until his body spoke louder than his voice. You step away from the imagined throne now, the scent of roast duck fading in your mind. Behind you, the silhouette of the king looms, not with a sword, not with a decree, but with his fullness, a shape carved from privilege, a monument to indulgence, a symbol of power, and a warning written in flesh. Now let's leave the palaces, the banquet halls, and the tombs behind for a moment. Step outside the gilded illusion and follow the Nile's gentle curve southward, where reeds sway along the riverbank and fishermen mend their nets in the sun. Here, far from the velvet cushions of the Pharaoh's throne, you'll meet the people who truly fed Egypt, the farmers, bakers, brewers, herders and foragers. Their bodies tell a very different story than the ones wrapped in linen and polished gold. Because while the elite stuffed themselves into godhood, the average Egyptian lived lean, hard and hungry. The contrast is sharp. You can almost feel it in the bones, literally. Archaeologists examining non-elite graves have found skeletons that are wiry, dense and marked by labour. Worn knees, arthritic spines, teeth ground down from coarse bread, and ribs that hint at periodic malnourishment. These were people who ate to survive, not to perform. Their diet was high in fibre, low in fat, and heavily dependent on seasonal crops and whatever protein could be scavenged or bartered. Bread, onions, lentils, leeks, dates, simple, repetitive, functional. And yet strangely they may have been healthier in some ways than their sacred rulers. No distended bellies here, no signs of gout or arterial clogging. Many commoners showed no evidence of the kind of metabolic breakdown that plagued the elite. Sure, they suffered from parasites, infections and the occasional skull fracture from poorly managed workplace drama, but they weren't collapsing under the weight of luxury. Their bodies were weathered, but honest. You'd think the pharaohs might have learned something from the people who kept their grain stores full, but the gap between the palace and the village was vast. The elite rarely interacted with the working class except to collect taxes, extract labour, or summon servants to the palace for feasts they could never eat at. And while peasants worshipped the same gods, they approached them with dirt under their nails, not gilded prayer scrolls. Their offerings were meagre, loaves of bread, sips of beer, the occasional vegetable. But maybe those offerings kept them more in balance than the oxen-sacrificing aristocrats. It's fascinating and a little depressing how dietary class lines shaped Egyptian society. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was hierarchy carved into your bones. The wealthy had access to meats, sweeteners, alcohol, and imported goods. The poor had access to sorghum and hope, and while the poor often starved during drought years, the rich literally ate themselves into immobility. Opposite ends of the same Nile, flowing in one direction. What's truly wild is that this division wasn't just economic, it was religious. The gods themselves were depicted receiving massive platters of roasted meats, fruits and beer, things only the elite could afford to offer. So peasants in turn offered what they had: vegetables, milk, the occasional fish. Their prayers were quieter, their rituals smaller, but maybe, just maybe, the gods listened anyway. And here's something curious. In some religious texts, moderation is praised. Instructions to live simply, avoid indulgence, and care for the body as a gift from the gods appear in wisdom literature and healing papyri. But who were those texts really for? Certainly not the kings hosting meat-flooded banquets every other week. It seems like the knowledge was there, but ignored, buried under layers of honey glaze and ritual wine. That said, even among commoners, there was hierarchy. Temple workers and scribes often lived better than farmers, with access to temple granaries and slightly more diverse diets. These semi-elite classes sometimes developed dental issues and early signs of obesity, just enough to suggest that once a little privilege was introduced, the body responded. But it rarely got out of hand. There was no golden couch to collapse into at the end of the day. A man who ate too much still had to show up at the granary in the morning. And then there were the soldiers, fit, mobile, lean, and mostly fueled by hard bread, dried dates, and good-dried meat. These weren't bodybuilders, but they were active and alert, living off simple foods with just enough calories to keep them alive through long, disparate marches. Some mummies of military men show almost no signs of internal decay. Strong bones, good muscle tone, decent teeth. They didn't live forever, but while they did, they moved like people who weren't weighed down by ceremonial ducks. Even women in lower classes, though overworked and vulnerable to complications from childbirth and poor sanitation, rarely showed signs of the obesity-related issues seen in the royal court. Their diets were modest but relatively well balanced in terms of nutrients. Leafy greens, onions, legumes and bread made from less refined grains offered a surprising amount of nutritional diversity. They weren't healthy by modern standards, but they weren't clogging their arteriates with fig paste either. Of course, none of this was romantic. These people lived short, hard lives. Many died in their 30s or 40s, their bodies etched with the physical demands of work and scarcity. But they didn't die of excess. Their bodies wore out from use, not from decay by indulgence. And that's what makes the contrast so sharp. In a land where divine order mattered above all else, the people closest to the earth lived within natural limits, while the ones claiming the sun as their father drowned in overabundance. There's even a strange justice in that. The workers who built the tombs were probably the healthiest people in them. Their spines may have ached, their hands calloused, but their blood moved cleanly through their veins. The kings who lay beneath golden masks, not so lucky. So as you walk along the river now, past the humble mud brick homes, the small garden plots, the children chasing chickens through alleyways, you start to see the kingdom in two layers, one heavy with wealth and wine, the other held together with lentils and labour. And maybe the gods, if they ever had preferences, watched both, the gluttons in gold and the lean ones who made the bread. Let's step away from the dusty kitchens and tombs and climb instead into the minds of those who tried to make sense of it all, the ancient Egyptian doctors, priests and scribes who wrestled with the mysteries of the body long before stethoscopes or health insurance were a thing. It's easy to assume that no one back then understood the damage caused by the pharaoh's extravagant diets. But the truth is more complicated. The ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly advanced, if slightly magical, approach to health. And buried inside their scrolls and rituals were warnings the kings might have done well to heed. Imagine this: a physician arrives at the palace, summoned to examine the divine body of a pharaoh who hasn't had a real bowel movement in 2 weeks. His knees ache, his breath wheezes, his fingers are swollen and his stomach feels like it's about to explode. The king, of course, won't say any of this aloud. He just sits there, scowling and clutching his ceremonial flail. But the physician knows. He's seen it before, and now he has to fix it. Ideally without offending a man who can have him turned into mummy jerky if he misreads the vibes. Egyptian medicine combined practical observation with spiritual belief. Illness wasn't just physical, it was cosmic imbalance. Blocked bowels could be caused by demons, swelling in the limbs, possibly punishment from an offended deity. But these explanations didn't stop physicians from experimenting with real remedies. Their texts include laxatives made from figs, enemas of milk and honey, poultices of herbs, and oils rubbed into joints with surprisingly accurate anatomical instructions. There were even surgical procedures for wounds and fractures. So yes, they knew a thing or two. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in the world, contains more than 700 prescriptions and spells for treating everything from toothaches to what sounds suspiciously like type 2 diabetes. While it doesn't name the condition directly, it mentions symptoms like excessive thirst, frequent urination, and sweet-smelling breath, all signs of insulin issues. The cure? A mix of wheat, fruit, and beer. Not great advice, but hey, points for recognising the problem. The problem was, none of these remedies worked long-term when the patient was still eating 10 times a day and washing it all down with a jug of spiced wine. For the elite, food was ritual, not nourishment. And that made the doctor's job both sacred and impossible. You couldn't tell a pharaoh to skip the 5th helping of honey-glazed goose without risking your head. So the physicians did what they could, wrapped symptoms in poetic phrases, applied salves, burned incense, and hoped that the gods were feeling merciful. Here's where things get really bizarre. In temple records, we find evidence that some pharaohs had personal physicians, almost like early private healthcare. These elite doctors were highly trained and often revered as holy men. They were allowed to touch the sacred body, inspect its fluids, even insert things into royal orifices if the situation got desperate. That level of trust meant these doctors likely saw the truth beneath the gold, the bloating, the pain, the heavy breathing during ceremonies. They knew. They just couldn't say it out loud, and sometimes not even the best physicians could save a king from himself. There are tomb inscriptions that mention withered limbs or sudden darkness of the heart, both of which could be interpreted as stroke or heart failure. In one case, a pharaoh reportedly collapsed during a festival after the blood in his chest rose like the flood. That's either metaphor or a particularly florid description of a cardiac event. Either way, his body was embalmed the next day, so not great. Even the concept of balance or ma'at applied to health. Just as the king was meant to maintain cosmic harmony in society, he was also supposed to embody it physically. But what happens when the symbol of cosmic balance can't climb a flight of stairs without assistance? When his stomach is larger than his sense of proportion? You can imagine the quiet stress among temple physicians trying to maintain appearances. A little extra linen here, a careful diet scroll slipped under a fruit platter there. It was medical work performed in whispers. Some physicians also turned to amulets and spells, believing that certain gods could relieve physical suffering. Sekhmet, The lion-headed goddess of war and healing was often invoked during illness, but she was temperamental. If she wasn't impressed, things went south quickly. In one ritual, a priest-doctor would recite incantations while anointing the king's belly with oil made from sacred plants. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Either way, the ritual mattered more than the result. Of course, there's a fringe theory that some priests and doctors actually encouraged overindulgence. Not because it helped, but because it kept the king dependent. A sick ruler needed more rituals, more healing, more divine interpretation. It was job security for the priesthood. The heavier the king, the more servants, offerings, and spells he required. And the more tightly the religious elite could wrap themselves around him like linen around a bloated corpse. The common people, by contrast, had far fewer options. If you were a farmer with a toothache, your choices were limited to chewing certain roots, smearing dung-based ointments on your jaw, or praying really hard. Doctors did treat the poor occasionally, but most medical attention was concentrated around the temples and royal courts. So while the pharaoh choked down another resin-drenched goose leg, his subjects hoped their homemade fig paste would cure whatever was killing them. Still, there's something almost heroic about those ancient physicians trying to patch up bodies that were disintegrating under the weight of sacred expectations. Their hands moved across royal skin with knowledge, reverence, and fear. They whispered healing words into ears too clogged to hear. They wrote scrolls full of hope and despair. And here you are in a shadowy chamber lit by a single flickering torch, reading over one of those scrolls. You see the words, to cool the swelling of the belly, to calm the troubled heart, to ease the fullness that burdens the god. It's part medicine, part poetry, and entirely human. A plea not just for health, but for mercy, for balance, for a chance to make the divine body feel something close to peace. The tomb is ready now, after months, sometimes years, of labour, cutting, painting, hauling, sealing and staging. The final resting place for the king stands complete beneath the desert sand, hidden from the world but prepared for eternity. The halls echo with silence, not yet filled with the ceremony of burial. You step inside before the procession arrives, torchlight flickering against images of feasting, worship and eternal joy. And as you pass scenes of golden chalices, stacked bread, and tables overflowing with duck and ox meat, one thing becomes clear. Death for a pharaoh isn't the end of indulgence, it's just a change of venue. Welcome to the Afterlife pantry, better stocked than any mortal kitchen, meticulously painted on every surface and spiritually engineered to last forever. Because in ancient Egyptian belief, the afterlife wasn't a place of judgment and restraint. It was a perfected version of life, a never-ending banquet where hunger didn't exist because the table was always full. The goal of burial preparation wasn't to strip the king of worldly pleasures. It was to guarantee he never went a moment without them again. That's why these tombs are filled with food. Real food, fake food, magically empowered food. Clay pots of dried grains and lentils, loaves of ceremonial bread wrapped in linen, jars of beer sealed with resin, honey, spices, smoked meats, dried figs, and when that wasn't practical, sculpted substitutes took their place. Wooden ducks, painted haunches of beef, stone loaves and clay jars, all engraved with magical texts that instructed them to become real in the afterlife. The king didn't have to eat stone. The gods would transform it into a feast the moment he crossed the threshold. Some tombs even had kitchens. Not literal stoves and sinks, but designated chambers filled with model ovens, servant figurines and rows of food offerings. It was like packing a mini palace in a suitcase. There were scenes of banquets carved in relief, sometimes with the king seated and served by gods themselves. The message? The pharaoh wouldn't just survive in the afterlife, he'd be fed better than ever. But this afterlife pantry was more than practical. It was symbolic insurance. In a kingdom obsessed with cosmic order, ensuring that the king continued to consume meant ensuring that Egypt itself remained in balance. If the pharaoh didn't eat, the sun might not rise. If his plate went empty, the Nile might fail to flood. The relationship between ruler and cosmos was so intertwined that feeding the dead king became a sacred national duty, and boy was he wed. Inscriptions from the tomb of Thutmose III list daily offerings meant for the afterlife. 40 loaves of bread, 20 jars of beer, 10 cuts of beef, of ducks, 4 geese, a basket of fruit, a pitcher of wine, and some sweet cakes, per day, not for a festival, every single day. The priests were responsible for replenishing these offerings, either physically or ritually, ensuring the eternal buffet never closed. Of course, no one believed the actual meat and bread lasted forever. That's where the magic came in. A priest would perform a ritual called the opening of the mouth, essentially turning the food into divine fuel. By speaking the right words, they activated the spiritual essence of each item. The clay duck became a real duck. The beer jar filled itself. The bread glowed with immortality. The king wouldn't just eat, he'd feast in supernatural HD. But if that sounds idyllic, consider the weird twist. The king's afterlife depended on being constantly served. Even in death, he wasn't free. He needed offerings, rituals, attention, priests had to be paid, temples endowed, rituals maintained. If something interrupted that cycle, if a temple lost funding or a priest skipped the ceremony, the king's eternal feast might flicker and fade. No offerings meant no sustenance. Immortality, it turned out, was a subscription service. This reliance sparked entire industries. Tomb workers, artisans, scribes, and temple cooks were all part of the machine that kept the dead kings alive. Some tombs even included backup servers, rows of Ushabti figures, tiny mummified servants, sometimes hundreds of them, ready to step in and cook, clean, serve, and prepare food in the next world. Eternal gig workers for an eternal glutton. And yet, for all this preparation, the king's actual body was still rotting. Sure, the embalmers did their best, but mummification had its limits. Over the centuries, many royal mummies bloated, blackened, leaked resin, or crumbled into unrecognisable lumps. Some were robbed, others were moved. A few ended up in museum basements or display cases, far from their promised palaces of eternity. And no matter how well the magical food was painted, you can't really eat from a wall. There's a bittersweet irony here. The kings who lived in luxury and died with every resource at their disposal still needed ongoing care to maintain the illusion. Their tombs were masterpieces, yes, but they were also desperate insurance policies. Vaults against the reality that all bodies decay, all food spoils, and even gods grow hungry in the dark. One fringe theory suggests that all this feasting in the afterlife was less about indulgence and more about fear. Fear that the king would be forgotten. Fear that his divine identity would fade. So they overcompensated. More food, more offerings, more carvings, until the walls could hardly hold it all. Anxious abundance painted over mortal fragility. And so you stand now in the centre of a silent tomb, the walls around you glowing with golden ducks, silver goblets, and pyramids of bread. It's beautiful, it's haunting, it's absurd. The pharaoh's body lies in its sealed sarcophagus, waiting for priests who no longer come. The food has long since turned to dust. The ritual has lapsed. The king, once the hungriest man in Egypt, now feasts only in memory. But somehow that was always the point. The ritual wasn't meant to feed the body, it was meant to feed the idea. The king may be dead, but the illusion of eternal fullness remains, etched forever into the stone. You're standing on the edge of it all now, the past trailing behind you like the long train of a royal robe, heavy with ceremony, gold leaf, and crumbs from 1,000 feasts. Egypt stretches out beneath your feet in layers. The glistening Nile, the bustling cities of scribes and artisans, the towering temples lined with gods, and finally the tombs tucked away in dry cliffs, filled with the silence of kings. And it hits you. The story of pharaonic obesity isn't really about the food, it's about power. Food was just the currency, obesity was the receipt. It's easy, maybe a little smug, to look back and laugh, to roll your eyes at the image of a divine ruler wheezing through a ritual jog, cheeks puffed with honey cakes, being fanned by a dozen shirtless servants, while a harpist plays softly to distract from his indigestion. But the truth is, this wasn't a failure of discipline. It was the end result of a system designed to trap everyone, especially the king, in a loop of symbolism that couldn't be broken. Because what you ate in ancient Egypt said everything about you. For the average person, food was a daily negotiation with survival. A good year meant there'd be enough grain to last until the next flood. A bad one meant hunger, maybe death. But for the pharaoh, food wasn't a concern, it was a performance. Every bite was political theatre. Every swallow, a declaration of cosmic control. The more visibly consumed, the more stability he was believed to command. Starving kings didn't inspire confidence. So he ate, not because he was hungry, but because the nation expected him to. And as dynasties rose and fell, the patterns didn't change. The priests kept feeding. The cooks kept preparing. The scribes kept recording. The statues kept lying. It was a cycle as dependable as the floodwaters of the Nile, and just as unforgiving. But what happens when the performance outpaces the performer? When the food becomes not just symbolic, but suffocating? The truth, whispered in embalming chambers and wrapped under linen, is that many pharaohs probably suffered terribly. Chronic pain, infections, obesity-related illnesses that had no names but very real consequences. They lived with symptoms the priests called curses and the doctors treated with rituals and fig paste, and when they died, the system just doubled down. More food offerings, more magical spells, more illusions. And yet, despite all of this, despite the bloated mummies and the overly literal tomb paintings and the CT scans showing joints eroded by a lifetime of luxury, there's still a strange beauty to it. Because underneath the gluttony was a yearning, to be remembered, to be honoured, to be eternal. The Egyptians didn't just want to live forever, they wanted to be known forever, even if that meant building entire industries to support an afterlife menu the size of a royal banquet. What's wild is how much of it worked. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about these rulers, still excavating their diets from the layers of history, trying to piece together their real bodies from the ones carved in stone. We may not envy their cholesterol levels, but there's something magnetic about them, isn't there? These men and women who lived like gods and left behind enough breadcrumbs, literal and metaphorical, to feed scholars for generations. There's an open question among Egyptologists that still doesn't have a clean answer. Did they know? Did the pharaohs realise they were dying from excess? Or did they believe, to the very end, that their fullness was divine? That the aching knees, the short breath, the swollen feet were simply the price of proximity to the gods? Maybe some of them figured it out. Maybe they just didn't care. After all, they weren't aiming for a ripe old age, they were aiming for eternity. And then there's the mirror we have to hold up to ourselves. Because while the circumstances have changed, the basic blueprint hasn't. We still celebrate indulgence. We still equate wealth with excess. We still build images of perfection that don't match the messy reality beneath. Ancient Egypt may be gone, but the theatre of consumption very much still running. As you leave the Valley of the Kings, the wind picks up a little, dry and warm and laced with centuries. You imagine the echoes of a distant festival, music, laughter, plates clinking. Somewhere in the distance, a priest chants a blessing over an impossibly large platter of duck. And there, seated at the centre of the celebration, is the king. His back is stiff, his eyes are tired, but he smiles, because everyone's watching. And that's the thing about being a pharaoh. You can never stop performing, not in life, not in death, not even when your stomach aches and your robe won't close. He raises a goblet. He takes another bite. He is full, he is powerful, he is trapped. So now that the torches have gone out and the tomb doors are sealed behind us, what are we really left with? Not just the image of overweight kings waddling through marble halls, but a full, complicated story about how power shapes bodies, how symbolism can outweigh sanity, and how even gods can be undone by too many cakes. The pharaohs weren't fools. They were trapped in a machine built of ritual, expectation and spectacle. And their diets, those were just the most edible parts of a much larger system. What makes this bedtime story stick in your teeth a little is how familiar it all feels. Different time, different continent, different gods, but the performance of power hasn't gone anywhere. We still glorify excess, we still confuse visibility with vitality. We still let people drown in indulgence as long as they do it with a good tailor and the right lighting. The difference is, we've traded tomb paintings for Instagram feeds, and instead of eternal bread loaves, we've got all-you-can-eat buffets. But maybe there's something comforting in knowing this isn't new, that even the mightiest rulers in history, with all their gold and priests and pyramids, couldn't escape their own appetites, that even in a culture obsessed with immortality, the body still had the final word, and that somewhere deep in a royal tomb a pharaoh is still lying there, beautiful mask above, bloated truth beneath, waiting for a meal that'll never come. So tonight, let that be your lullaby. A kingdom built on bread, a god who couldn't say no, and the gentle truth that sometimes even the divine need a nap after dinner.